The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Alara Voss had not planned to attend the Hargrove ball that evening. She had spent most of the afternoon sitting at the edge of her mother's bed, listening to the shallow, uneven sound of her breathing, counting seconds between each rise and fall of the thin chest beneath the quilt. Her younger sister Clara had been in the kitchen downstairs making soup that no one would eat, moving around the pots and pans with the careful quietness of someone trying very hard not to cry. The house smelled like medicine and old wood, and outside the windows the sky was the deep charcoal gray that comes just before the first hard frost of the year. The letter was not addressed to Alara. It was addressed to her father, Philip Voss, who had been dead for 11 months, and whose debts had been quietly growing in a locked drawer in his study ever since. Alara had been the one to find the drawer. She had been the one to open it. And she had been the one sitting alone at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, reading through pages and pages of borrowed money and broken promises, understanding slowly and then all at once that the life she and Clara had believed was stable was built entirely on ground that was already giving way beneath them. The letter that arrived on the Tuesday evening was from a man named Gerald Holt. He was the kind of man whose name appeared at the bottom of letters and never in conversations, the kind whose business was conducted in dim offices and whose dealings were never quite spoken about in polite company. He had been one of her father's creditors, and according to the letter, which Alara read 3 times standing in the hallway with her coat still on, he was no longer willing to wait. He had spoken, he said, to several people of consequence. He had made it known, in the particular careful way that meant everyone already knew, that the Voss family's situation was one of some difficulty, and he had taken the additional step, which was written in the 3rd paragraph in language so polite, it took Alara a full minute to understand what she was reading, of suggesting to a particular circle of society that Clara, who was 18, and had been quietly preparing for her first proper season, was a young woman whose family could no longer be considered reputable. Alara put the letter down on the hall table. She picked it up again. She read the 3rd paragraph one more time. Then she put on her coat properly, buttoned it to the top, and told Clara she would be back before midnight. The Hargrove estate was 40 minutes by carriage from the Voss house, and Alara spent those 40 minutes in the dark cab with her hands folded in her lap and her mind working through every possible option she had. There were not many. Her mother could not be moved. The debts were real. The house would have to be sold within the year regardless. But Clara's season, Clara's one real chance at a future that did not involve becoming a governess in someone else's house, Clara's carefully sewn dresses and her bright, hopeful face every time she talked about the spring, all of that depended on the family name remaining intact, and Gerald Holt was in the process of tearing that name apart one quiet conversation at a time. She had no plan when she arrived at the estate. She had only the letter in her pocket, and the very clear understanding that someone at that ball would know Gerald Holt, and that someone might be persuaded to speak to him on the family's behalf if approached correctly. It was not a good plan. It was barely a plan at all, but it was what she had, and Alara Voss had learned in the past 11 months that the difference between a person who survived difficulty and one who did not was almost never intelligence or money. It was almost always the willingness to walk through a door when you had no idea what was on the other side. The Hargrove estate was lit from every window. The sound of the gathering reached the carriage before the building itself came into view, a low, warm hum of voices and music that seemed to push against the cold night air and hold it back. Alara stepped out of the cab, straightened her dress, which was the best she owned and still 2 seasons old, and walked inside. She did not belong there, and she knew it. She had received no formal invitation, and the man at the door had looked at her with an expression that suggested he was deciding between turning her away and asking no questions at all, and she had smiled at him with the kind of calm confidence she did not feel, and walked past him before he finished deciding. It was the sort of thing her father used to do, and thinking about it made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The ballroom was enormous. It was the kind of room that made a person feel slightly smaller simply by existing inside it. The ceilings were high and lit by several chandeliers that threw soft gold light across the faces of 100 people who all seemed to know each other, who all seemed entirely at ease in their own expensive clothes, who all seemed to be having the kind of conversations that did not include words like debt, or consequence, or please. Alara moved through the room slowly, looking for a face she recognized, finding 2 or 3 and none of them useful, circling back toward the windows along the far wall where the crowd was thinner and the air was slightly cooler. That was when she heard it. 2 women standing near the curtain by the south window, speaking in the kind of low voices that were designed to be private, and were in fact perfectly audible to anyone standing 3 feet away. One of the women was tall, with dark hair piled high, and a necklace of green stones at her throat. The other was shorter, with an expression of particular pleasure that people sometimes wear when they are delivering news they enjoy. The younger one is quite pretty, actually, the shorter woman said, but of course that hardly matters now. Holt has been very thorough. I heard Lord Pemberton already told his son to withdraw the interest he had expressed. And you know what that means for the girl's chances. The mother is ill, I believe, the tall woman said, not unkindly, but without warmth either. It is a sad situation. Sad, yes, but entirely of their own making. The father was reckless with his finances for years and everyone knew it. They simply didn't know the extent of it. Ilara stood very still. The marble floor beneath her was cold through the thin soles of her shoes. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that felt unpleasant, too loud, too fast, too present in the middle of this glittering room where she was not supposed to be. She turned away from the window. She needed air. She needed a moment to think. She needed to not stand in this particular spot and listen to two women discuss her sister's future as though it were a topic of mild social interest, like the weather or a mediocre painting at a gallery. She moved through a side door and found herself in a corridor that led to the back of the house, and from there she followed a second door into the garden. The garden at the back of the Hargrove estate was large and almost entirely dark. There were lanterns along the main path, but the path curved away from the house and the lanterns were spaced far enough apart that the spaces between them were genuine shadow. Ilara walked down the path because walking felt better than standing still, because the cold air was doing something useful for the pressure behind her eyes, because she needed 30 seconds to be somewhere that was not that ballroom. She sat down on a low stone bench near the garden wall and pressed the letter in her pocket flat against her knee, and breathed. She did not hear him approach. He was simply not there, and then he was, standing a few feet away from her on the path, and the lantern light behind him meant she could see his outline clearly before she could see his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark formal clothes with a perfectly straight posture that suggested either military background or a great deal of practice. He stopped when he saw her. He did not speak immediately. I apologize, Ilara said, standing at once. I was not aware this part of the garden was restricted. I'll return inside. It is not restricted, the man said. His voice was even and low, and had the quality of a room that had been carefully kept at the same temperature for a very long time. You are not in anyone's way. She looked at him more carefully now. He had dark hair, slightly gray at the edges, and a face that was not unkind but was very controlled. He looked like a man who chose every expression deliberately. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky just before snow, and they were fixed on her with an attention that was not rude, but was also not casual. You came without an invitation, he said. It was not a question. Ilara felt the embarrassment of it rise in her throat, and then made the deliberate choice to push it back down. I did, she said simply. I had a reason. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at her, and then past her, toward the house, and she had the odd feeling that he was calculating something quickly and precisely. You are Ilara Voss, he said. She blinked. Yes. Philip Voss was your father. He was. And Gerald Holt sent you a letter today. Ilara went very still. The night was quiet around them. Just the distant sound of music from the ballroom and the cold movement of wind through the garden hedges. She looked at this man, this stranger with the winter eyes, and tried to understand how he knew any of that. How do you know that? She asked. Because I know Holt, he said, and I know how he operates. And because someone in that ballroom tonight pointed you out to me 15 minutes ago and told me you had arrived uninvited, and I recognized your name. He had recognized her name. She filed that information away and addressed the more pressing question. Then you know what he intends, she said. I know what he has already done, the man said, and his voice did not change, but something in it became more precise, more careful, in the way of someone handling something fragile. I heard the conversation you were listening to near the south window. I was standing behind you. Ilara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them again. Then you also know, she said steadily, that there is very little time before what he has started becomes impossible to stop. Yes, the man said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she was not prepared for, something so simple and so direct that it took her breath away entirely. Marry me, he said. Not tonight. Formally, properly, with a proper announcement. But quickly, within the week if possible. The garden was very quiet. A lantern somewhere along the path was flickering. I don't know your name, Ilara said. Edmund Hargrove, he said. Duke of Ashvale. This is my estate. She stared at him. Edmund Hargrove. She knew the name the way everyone knew the name. from newspapers and from the particular tone of voice people used when they said it, a tone that carried equal parts respect and wariness. The Duke of Ashvale was known to be extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily private, and extraordinarily difficult to read. He had not been publicly connected to any woman in years. He was said to be cold. He was said to be precise. He was said to have no interest whatsoever in the ordinary concerns of ordinary life. He was now standing in his own garden in the dark, offering her his name. Why? She asked. It was the only question that mattered. He looked at her for a long moment. Because Holt has crossed a line, he said, and because I am in a position to draw a new one. He paused. And because your sister should have her season. Alara looked at this man. She looked at his steady gray eyes and his controlled expression, and the way he stood, as though he had decided something, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. She thought about Clara. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about her mother's breathing, and the locked drawer in her father's study, and the two women by the south window. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. And you're offering to bind your name to mine based on 15 minutes in a garden. I am offering to bind my name to yours based on the understanding that Holt's behavior is something I find unacceptable, and that I have the means to stop it. He paused. The rest can be discussed later. Alara stood in the cold garden of a man she had met 7 minutes ago, and felt the ground beneath her shifting in a direction she had not planned for. This was not the option she had come here looking for. This was not even close to the option she had imagined. But she had walked through a door tonight with no idea what was on the other side, and on the other side had been this. I need to think, she said. Of course, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small card. This is my address in town. Send word in the morning if you are willing. If you are not, I will understand, and tonight will remain between us. She took the card. It was plain white with only his name and address, no ornamentation, nothing unnecessary. She looked at it for a moment and then looked back at him. And if I say yes, she said, what exactly are you expecting from this arrangement? His expression did not change. Your name beside mine on a piece of legal paper, he said. Nothing else is required. She almost said something, and then did not. She put the card in her pocket next to the letter. The two pieces of paper rested against each other in the dark of her coat, while the distant music from the ballroom floated out across the cold garden, and the night pressed in from all sides. She left the garden without saying goodbye. She did not look back. She walked through the side door and down the corridor and out through the front of the estate and into the waiting carriage, and she sat in the dark the entire ride home with her hands folded in her lap and her mind entirely, completely still. When she got home, Clara was asleep in her chair in the kitchen with the soup gone cold on the stove. Alara put a blanket over her sister's shoulders, turned off the kitchen lamp and went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a very long time. Then she took both pieces of paper out of her pocket. She put Gerald Holt's letter on the nightstand and held Edmund Hargrove's card in her hands and looked at the name written there in plain black ink. She did not sleep that night, but by the time the first gray light of morning came through the curtains, she had made her decision. She wrote the letter to Edmund Hargrove's town address at 7 in the morning, in her best handwriting, in 3 sentences. She said yes. She said she understood the terms. She said she would be available to discuss the arrangement at his earliest convenience. She sealed it, she sent it. And then she went downstairs and made breakfast and did not tell Clara anything yet, because Clara would ask questions that Alara did not yet have answers to, because there was a man she had met in a garden in the dark who had offered her something she did not fully understand, and she had said yes to it, and the shape of what came next was still entirely unclear. What she did know, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea going warm in her hands and the morning light coming through the window, was this. The ground had been giving way beneath her for almost a year, and last night, in the dark, something solid had appeared under her feet. Whether it would hold her weight was a question she would not be able to answer for a very long time. But she had said yes, and she was not sorry. Not yet. Edmund Hargrove received the letter at 8:47 in the morning. He read it twice at his desk in the townhouse study, then set it face down on the blotter and looked out the window at the narrow London street below. A cart was passing. A woman with a basket was walking quickly in the cold. 2 sparrows were arguing on a branch across the way. None of this had anything to do with the letter on his desk, and yet Edmund looked at all of it for exactly 60 seconds before turning back to his papers. He did not react to news the way other men did. He had learned that a long time ago. Reaction was the enemy of clear thinking, and clear thinking was the only tool Edmund had ever trusted. Not connections, not charm, not the particular ease with which some men move through the world as though it had been arranged for them personally. Edmund had always moved through the world as though it was a problem to be solved, and he had been very good at solving problems for a very long time. The problem he had introduced into his own life last night was not small. He called for his aide, a man named Frederick who had been with him for 12 years and who had the excellent quality of never looking surprised by anything. Edmund told Frederick to arrange a meeting for the following morning with Miss Alara Voss at the townhouse, to see to it that the drawing room was put in order and that tea was available, and to notify no one else about the meeting for any reason whatsoever. Frederick said he would see to it. Edmund said thank you. Frederick left. Edmund returned to the letter on his desk. He was not a man who made decisions carelessly. He was, in fact, the opposite of that. The people who moved in his circles, the men who sat across tables from him in the course of business, the women who had long since stopped trying to interest him in the ordinary ways, they all described him in the same terms, whether they liked him or not. Precise, controlled, difficult to read. Cold, some of them said, though Edmund did not think that was accurate exactly. He simply did not see the point of making his interior life available to people who had not earned the right to it. He had earned his privacy the hard way, and he kept it with care. What he had done last night in the garden was, by any reasonable measure, an exception to every rule he had ever followed. He told himself it was not impulsive. He told himself, sitting at his desk with the letter under his hand, that it had been a considered decision made on the basis of clear reasoning. Gerald Holt had been a problem on the edges of Edmund's awareness for some time. The man was not merely unpleasant, he was actively dangerous in the particular way of people who understood that reputation was currency, and had decided to become counterfeiters. Edmund had watched Holt work his specific brand of quiet destruction on 2 other families in the past 3 years, and both times he had done nothing, because it had not been his place. But last night in the ballroom, standing behind a young woman who was very clearly trying not to let her distress show as she listened to 2 gossips dismantle her family's future, Edmund had felt something shift in a way he had not anticipated. He had not recognized the woman's face. He had recognized her name, Voss, only because he had known Philip Voss slightly and had been aware, in the general way of knowing things he never intended to use, that Philip Voss had died leaving a considerable mess behind him. But seeing the daughter standing there, straight-backed and still-faced in a dress that was slightly old and in shoes that were clearly cold through, hearing the level even breath she took before she turned away from the window, Edmund had felt something he did not have an entirely comfortable word for. It was not sympathy. Edmund was capable of sympathy, but it had never moved him to anything as dramatic as a marriage offer in a garden. It was something closer to recognition. The particular expression on Alara Voss's face had been one Edmund understood very well. It was the expression of a person who has accepted that the situation is bad and has decided to handle it anyway. He had worn that expression himself for 4 years. He recognized it the way you recognize a road you have walked in the dark. He had offered to marry her because it was the fastest and cleanest solution to the specific problem in front of him. That was what he told himself. That was also, he was fairly certain, most of the truth. The rest of the truth was something he had no intention of examining too closely. The following morning, Alara Voss arrived at the townhouse at exactly 9 o'clock. Frederick let her in and brought her to the drawing room, where Edmund was already seated and had already reviewed, in his own mind, every point he intended to address. He had made notes. He had not brought the notes to the meeting because he had memorized them, but they existed, written in his neat, precise hand on a sheet of paper now face down on his study desk, because Edmund Hargrove did not go into any significant conversation unprepared. She was less pale than she had been in the garden. She had slept, or something approximating it. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was a different dress from last night, but still had the quality of being carefully worn, the quality of something treated with great attention, because replacement was not currently possible. She sat down across from him with her hands in her lap and looked at him with a directness that he found, despite himself, refreshing. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation." She looked around the drawing room briefly, taking it in without comment. Then she looked back at him. "I imagine you have terms." "I do," he said, "and I imagine you have questions." "Several," she agreed. He nodded. "Then let me speak first, and you can stop me when something needs clarifying." She nodded. He began. He was direct, because directness was a courtesy he believed in. The marriage would be legal and formal, announced promptly, conducted within the week if she was willing, within 2 weeks at the outside. Speed was important, because Holt's work was already in progress, and the announcement needed to precede the damage wherever possible. The engagement announcement would appear in the appropriate papers, her family name tied to his, would make Gerald Holt's campaign both pointless and socially risky for him to continue, because no one with a working understanding of social mechanics picked a fight with the Duke of Ashvale over a woman that Duke had chosen to marry. In terms of the practical arrangement, Edmund continued, she would move into Ashvale Manor as his wife. She would have her own set of rooms in the East Wing, her own schedule, her own staff. He would not make demands on her time beyond what social appearances required. Those appearances would be occasional and could be negotiated in advance. There would be no expectation of any kind beyond what was publicly necessary. He paused. In plain terms, he said, I am offering you my name, my protection, financial stability for yourself and your family, and your freedom to live your life within this house as you choose. I am asking for very little in return. Your presence when required. Your discretion always. Alara had listened to all of this without interrupting. She was looking at him steadily, and there was something in her expression that he could not categorize. Not relief exactly. Not suspicion exactly. Something in between those two things, something watchful and thinking. Your financial stability, she said. You mentioned my family. Does that include my mother's medical care? Yes, he said without hesitation. And Clara's season, the costs associated with it. Yes. And the debts my father left. Edmund looked at her. This was the part most people would have hesitated to raise, and she raised it without looking away. Yes, he said, those will be handled. She was quiet for a moment. That is a great deal to offer a stranger, she said. It is, he agreed. But the amount I am offering is not significant to me, and the benefit to you is substantial. I am a practical man. This seems like a practical solution. To your problem as well as mine, she said. He looked at her. He had not said he had a problem, and he noticed that she had drawn the correct conclusion anyway. To a problem I have been aware of for some time, he said carefully, yes. She considered this. Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt is part of it, he said. There are other aspects that I am not in a position to explain fully right now, but I want you to understand that this arrangement benefits me as well as you. I am not offering charity. I am offering a transaction, which we are both entering with clear eyes, she said. That is my intention, yes. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. And the personal terms. You said separate rooms. Yes. Separate lives, essentially, inside the same house. Yes. No expectation of affection. No pretense in private. Correct. She was quiet for a moment. And publicly? Publicly we are a couple, courteous to each other, not cold. I will not require a performance from you, but I will need us to appear at minimum as two people who respect each other, which, if we are honest, seems achievable. The corner of her mouth moved very slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was something in that direction, and Edmund noted it the way he noted everything, quietly and without displaying that he had done so. And if the arrangement becomes uncomfortable, she said, if one of us finds that it isn't working, then we discuss it, he said, like adults. She nodded. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The drawing room was quiet. Outside, the sparrows were still arguing, or different sparrows were arguing. It was impossible to say. I have one more question, she said. Go ahead. Why me specifically, she said. You could have done this for someone else. You could have paid Holt off, or warned him off, through some other channel, without attaching yourself to any of this. Why go this far? Edmund was quiet for exactly the amount of time it took him to choose his words precisely. Because paying Holt off stops one problem for one person, he said. Because the solution I am proposing stops the problem permanently and more completely. He paused. And because I watched you stand in that ballroom last night and listen to your family being discussed, and I watched you choose, very deliberately, to handle it rather than fall apart, and I decided that was a quality I was willing to attach my name to. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a very unusual compliment, she said. I am a very unusual man, he said. The arrangement was settled. Frederick brought in the contract, which Edmund had prepared that morning. It was 3 pages of clear, precise language, with no ambiguity in it anywhere. Edmund had written it himself. Alara read all 3 pages, which he had expected her to do and which most people in his experience would not have done, and she asked 2 clarifying questions about the language in the second paragraph, both of which were good questions, and Edmund answered them. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name. Edmund signed his. Frederick witnessed it. And that was that. They sat in the drawing room for a few minutes afterward, not quite comfortable but not quite uncomfortable either, in the particular quiet of 2 people who have just made a large decision together, and are both processing what that means. The announcement, Alara said finally. When? Tomorrow morning. Edmund said. I'll handle the papers. You don't need to do anything except be prepared for questions from people who know you. Clara doesn't know yet, she said. Then I would tell her today, he said. She nodded. She stood up. He stood up. They faced each other across the drawing room. This woman he had met in a garden 36 hours ago who was now, on paper, his wife. This is very strange, she said. Yes, he agreed. I imagine it will feel stranger when it is public. Probably, he said, but things settle, they usually do. She nodded. She picked up her gloves from the table beside her. At the door of the drawing room she paused and turned back. Thank you, she said, for what you are doing. Even if it benefits you as well, it also helps us considerably, and I am not so proud that I won't acknowledge that. Edmund looked at her. In 11 years of running his business affairs and his estate and his life, with the precision of a man who left nothing to chance, he had been thanked many times. He had never particularly noticed it. He noticed it now, though he could not have said exactly why. You are welcome, he said. She left. He heard the front door close. He stood in the drawing room for a moment and then went back to his study. He did not look at his notes on the desk. He sat down in his chair and looked at the window, and thought about the way she had read all 3 pages of the contract without rushing, and the way she had asked exactly the right 2 questions, and the way she had looked at him when she said the thing about it being strange. He had told her things settled. They usually did. He believed that. He had believed it for a long time, through circumstances that had tested the belief considerably. He had not expected, when he walked into his own garden last night, to be sitting here this morning with a signed contract in his desk drawer, and a woman named Alara Voss becoming by law the Duchess of Ashvale. Things settled. He sat very still at his desk and looked at the window and listened to the London street outside going about its ordinary business, and he told himself that this was a practical decision made for practical reasons, and that was all it was, and that was enough. He believed most of that. The announcement appeared in the morning papers 2 days later. Edmund had written it himself, 3 lines, formal and precise, stating that Edmund George Hargrove, Duke of Ashvale, was pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Alara Frances Voss, daughter of the late Philip Voss. The ceremony was to be held within the fortnight at the Hargrove Estate Chapel. Alara read it at the kitchen table at 6:40 in the morning with Clara sitting across from her in stunned silence. Clara had been told the night before. Alara had sat with her sister at that same table and explained as much as she could explain, which was not everything, because some parts of the truth were still too large and too raw to put into simple words. She said that she had met Edmund Hargrove. She said that they had made an arrangement that was good for the family. She said that Clara's season would happen as planned, that their mother's care was secured, that the debts were being handled. Clara had looked at her sister for a long time with very bright eyes. Do you like him? She asked. I find him straightforward, Alara said, which was true. I think he is a decent man. That isn't what I asked, Clara said. I know, Alara said. Clara did not ask again. She reached across the table and held her sister's hand for a moment. Alara let her. Neither of them said anything, and in the quiet of the kitchen with the lamp burning low between them, both sisters understood several things that did not need to be spoken out loud. Now the announcement was in the paper, and the question of what Alara Voss felt or did not feel about Edmund Hargrove was no longer relevant to anyone's mourning. What was relevant was that the letter from Gerald Holt was still in the drawer of the nightstand upstairs, and it had not yet been answered, and Alara thought about what his face might look like when he read those 3 lines in the paper, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was almost peace. Almost, not entirely, because somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the relief and the practical certainty and the steady knowledge that she had made the right decision, there was a quieter thought, a smaller one that had started in the drawing room of the townhouse when Edmund Hargrove had looked at her and told her that he had watched her choose to handle it rather than fall apart, and that he had decided that was a quality he was willing to attach his name to. She had told him it was an unusual compliment. He had said he was an unusual man. She was beginning to think he was right about that. She was also beginning to think that the house she was moving into at the end of the week was going to be considerably more interesting and considerably more complicated than any house she had ever lived in before. She folded the paper neatly. She set it on the table. She made breakfast for herself and Clara, and the morning came through the windows in its ordinary way, and nothing about the world outside had changed. But something had, and both of them knew it. Ashvale Manor was not what Alara had imagined. She had expected grandeur, and the grandeur was there. But grandeur and warmth are not the same thing, and the difference between them was something she understood within the first 10 minutes of arriving. The carriage turned through the iron gates at midday. The driveway was long and perfectly maintained, and lined with old oak trees that stood bare and very tall on either side, their branches reaching toward each other without quite touching. The manor itself appeared at the end of the drive like a statement, a large, serious gray stone building with many windows and a front door that seemed designed to communicate, gently but firmly. That entry was not to be taken lightly. The winter light fell across the facade without softening it. The building looked back at Ilara without expression. She stepped out of the carriage. She stood for a moment and looked at the house. The house did not look away. A man named Frederick, whom she had met briefly at the townhouse, was at the door to greet her and to introduce her to the household staff, who had assembled in the entrance hall in a neat line. There were 8 of them, from the cook, a small round woman named Mrs. Burrow, to the groundskeeper, a thin man named Aldous, who shook her hand once and said nothing. They all greeted her respectfully. None of them seemed particularly at ease. That might have been ceremony, Ilara told herself. That might simply have been the natural formality of a large estate household meeting its new mistress. Or it might have been something else. She would find out which, in time. Edmund was not at the door to greet her. Frederick said, quietly and without apology, that the Duke was occupied with correspondence and would see her at dinner. Ilara said that was perfectly fine. She followed a young housemaid named Polly up the main staircase to the rooms she had been given in the west wing of the house. Her rooms were large. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that they were clean and adequately furnished, and entirely without personality. The walls were a neutral gray. The curtains were heavy and dark. The furniture was good quality but arranged in the way of a room that no one had lived in for some time. Everything slightly too placed, slightly too even, like a room that had been set up according to a diagram rather than by someone who actually knew how to make a space feel inhabited. There was a fireplace, and the fire was already lit, and that was the warmest thing in the room. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Your Grace?" Polly asked, and the words surprised Ilara slightly, because she had not yet internalized the title she was now wearing alongside the name, and being addressed by it felt like being handed a coat that was the right size, but not yet broken in. "Yes," Ilara said. "Thank you, Polly." Polly looked slightly startled to be thanked. She recovered quickly and left. Ilara stood in the middle of her large, clean, neutral rooms and listened to the silence. The house was quiet. Not the quiet of a house where people were occupied elsewhere, but the particular quiet of a house where noise had been absent long enough that the silence had become structural, had become part of what the building was made of. She could hear the fire. She could hear the wind outside. She could hear her own footsteps as she walked to the window and looked out at the garden below, the same garden where she had met Edmund in the dark less than 2 weeks ago. It looked different in daylight, larger and more formal, and very still. There was no one in it. She turned from the window and began, methodically, to unpack her things. Dinner that evening was in the large dining room, which was set for 2 but felt, in its dimensions, like a room set for 20. She and Edmund sat at one end of the table across from each other. The food was excellent, which was something, and they spoke with the careful, polite efficiency of 2 people who were managing a situation they had both agreed to, but had not yet learned to navigate. Edmund asked how her rooms were. She said they were fine. She asked about the estate's grounds. He described them briefly. She mentioned that the garden was larger than she had expected. He said it had been expanded some years ago. She said she would like to explore it when the weather allowed. He said she was welcome to do so at any time. None of this was unpleasant. None of it was anything else either. When dinner was finished, Edmund stood and said goodnight in the same tone he had used to describe the grounds, even and precise, and left the dining room. Ilara sat at the table for a few minutes with her tea going cold in front of her. Then she went upstairs. She wrote a letter to Clara that night. She described the house accurately, the gray stone and the high ceilings and the excellent cook and the very well-trained staff. She described Edmund as courteous and organized and busy. She described the garden as beautiful, which she believed it would be in summer. She did not describe the silence, because she did not know how to describe it in a way that would not alarm her sister. She sealed the letter and set it on the desk to be sent in the morning, and then she sat in the chair by the fire and thought. The first week was like that. A series of polite dinners, separate mornings. She read in the library, which was excellent, and which appeared to actually be used, this being the one room in the house that felt genuinely inhabited. Edmund's presence in the manor was something she knew about more through evidence than through encounter. His study light was on before she woke, and still on when she came upstairs at night. His meals were taken at regular times. Frederick moved through the house with quiet efficiency, managing a calendar that seemed full and detailed and entirely invisible to everyone but himself and Edmund. She explored the house in her own time. The rooms she was permitted to explore, which was most of them, were all in the same condition as her own. Clean, maintained, cold in the particular way that had nothing to do with temperature. The sitting rooms were furnished but not used. The music room had an excellent piano with the lid closed. The morning room had a writing desk and several chairs arranged near the windows and a view of the east garden that was genuinely lovely. And Alara made that room her own within the first few days, simply by using it, by moving a chair slightly and putting her books on the windowsill and leaving a cup of tea on the desk. She was there, in the morning room, on the 5th day, when she heard something unexpected. She had been reading for an hour and was considering whether to go down to the kitchen and ask Mrs. Burrow if there was any possibility of something with cinnamon, because the morning was cold and gray and she had developed a particular appreciation for Mrs. Burrow's spiced biscuits, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the morning room and then, through the slightly open door, a sound she had not heard once in the 5 days she had been in this house. Laughter. Low, brief, entirely genuine. And then Edmund's voice, saying something she could not quite make out, and then Frederick's voice, and then another quiet moment of that laughter before the footsteps continued down the corridor. It was a small thing, 10 seconds of sound through a half-open door, but Alara sat in her chair by the window and held her book in her lap and found that she was thinking about it more than its size seemed to warrant, because that laugh had been the first human-sounding thing she had heard from Edmund Hargrove since she arrived in his house, and it meant something. She was not entirely sure what, but it meant something, that underneath the surface of all that controlled precision, there was something that could still find the world briefly funny. She filed it away. She did not know why. The second week brought something different. She was in the library after dinner one evening, because the dining room conversation had been particularly short and she was not ready to go upstairs, when Edmund came in. He did not seem to have expected her to be there. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. "I was looking for the Hargrove land survey," he said, which seemed like an explanation for his presence rather than an acknowledgement of her presence, which was fair enough. "I'm in the poetry section," she said. "I suspect your land survey is not here." He almost smiled. She was almost certain of it. "No," he agreed. "It won't be." He crossed the room to the far shelves, where the estate documents were organized in a separate set of folders, and found what he was looking for within about 45 seconds, which was, she thought, very fast. He was about to leave when she spoke again. "The music room," she said. "Does anyone use it?" He stopped. He turned to look at her. "No," he said. "The piano is excellent." "It was my mother's," he said. "She played well." There was a fraction of a second's pause. Just a fraction. Almost nothing. But Alara was sitting still in a quiet room, and she had been paying attention to this man for 10 days, and she caught it. "Did she live here long?" Alara asked. "Until I was 12, he said. "After that she preferred the London house." He said it in a tone that closed the subject. Not unkindly but firmly, the tone of a door being shut from the inside. Alara let it close. She looked back at her book. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, and left. She sat in the library for another hour with the poetry book open in her lap, not reading, thinking instead about the music room and the closed piano lid and the stopped-sounding way he had said "until I was 12, and the fact that in 10 days she had learned almost nothing about Edmund Hargrove as a human being and almost everything about him as a functioning system. The third week she began to notice things she had not noticed before, because 3 weeks of living somewhere gives you a different kind of sight than 3 days. She noticed that there was always a fresh candle on her reading desk in the morning room before she arrived, though she had never mentioned needing one. She noticed that the book she had expressed a vague interest in during a dinner conversation appeared on the library shelf with a small card marking the first page the following afternoon. She noticed that when she mentioned, once, in passing, that her rooms were very cold in the early mornings, the temperature of those rooms changed within 2 days without any conversation about it. Edmund never mentioned any of these things. There was no note, no comment at dinner, no indication at all that he had done them, and she could not be entirely certain it was him, except that it was clearly not Frederick, and Frederick was the only other person in the house with the authority to make such changes, and she suspected, with no proof at all, that the instruction came from one direction. She did not thank him, because he had not admitted to it, and thanking someone for something they have not admitted to is a particular kind of conversation, and she was not sure, yet, whether they were ready for that kind. But she thought about it. She sat in her warm rooms in the early morning, with the new candle burning on the desk, and the book with the marked page open in her hands, and she thought about what it meant that a man who said nothing personal and revealed nothing private was quietly doing small, specific things to make her life in his house more comfortable. It might mean nothing. Some people were simply organized that way, attentive to household management as a matter of course. It might mean something. She was not yet sure which, but she was paying attention, and she realized, looking forward to finding out. That realization sat in her chest quietly, not demanding anything, not pushing for any particular conclusion. Just sitting there, present and waiting, the way a question sits in the mind before you know what the answer is. She turned a page. Outside the window, the winter pressed against the glass. The fire crackled in the morning room. The house was quiet. But it was beginning, just slightly, to feel less empty. On the 21st day, Clara came to visit. Edmund had offered, in one of their dinner conversations, to have the guest rooms prepared for any family Alara wished to invite. She had not taken him up on it immediately, because she had not been certain what it would look like, Clara and Edmund in the same room, her two worlds meeting across a dining table. But by the third week she was ready, and she wrote to Clara, and Clara arrived on a Thursday morning in a carriage Edmund had sent, wearing her best coat, and looking around the manor entrance hall with the expression of someone trying very hard to appear unsurprised. Alara hugged her at the door. Clara hugged her back hard and whispered, "It is enormous," into her shoulder, and Alara laughed, which was the first time she had laughed in this house, and the sound of it in the entrance hall surprised her slightly. Polly showed Clara to her guest room, and Mrs. Burrow produced lunch, and then the two sisters sat in the morning room together in the two chairs by the window, and the afternoon came in flat and gray and very comfortable, and Alara felt something loosen in her chest that she had not entirely realized was tight. "You look better than I expected," Clara said, after they had talked for an hour. "What did you expect?" Alara asked. "I wasn't sure," Clara said. "I thought maybe you would look like someone who had made a very difficult bargain, and was living with the weight of it." She looked at her sister. "You don't look like that." "I might just be hiding it well," Alara said. "You can't hide things from me," Clara said. "I have known you all my life." She looked around the morning room with its moved chair and its books on the windowsill, and the cup on the desk. "You've made this room yours," she said. "It needed someone in it," Alara said. "And the rest of the house?" Alara was quiet for a moment. "The rest of the house," she said carefully, "is still working out what it thinks of me." Clara looked at her. "And the Duke?" "He is very much the same," Alara said. Clara nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it lonely?" Alara thought about the candle on the desk in the mornings. She thought about the book with the marked page. She thought about the 10 seconds of laughter she had heard through a half-open door. She thought about Edmund Hargrove standing in the library with a land survey in his hand, almost smiling. "It is complicated," she said, "but I don't think it is entirely what it seems." Clara looked at her for a long moment, in the way that only a sister looks at you, all the way through the surface of things to whatever is underneath. "Good," Clara said finally. "I think that's good." Edmund joined them for dinner that evening. Alara had been quietly curious about this, because Edmund at dinner was one thing when it was only the two of them, and Edmund at dinner with Clara was an entirely different calibration. Clara was warm and bright and entirely without the social caution that most people exercised in the presence of a duke. She asked Edmund questions the way people who grew up in easy households ask questions, with genuine interest and no fear of the answer. She asked about the estate. He described it. She asked what he did with his days. He explained his work, which involved a considerable amount of correspondence with various business concerns and estate management that sounded, when he described it, genuinely complex and genuinely interesting. Clara asked a follow-up question. Edmund answered it in more detail than Alara had expected. And then Clara, being Clara, said, "Do you like her?" There was a silence. Alara looked at her sister with an expression that said several things at once, none of them polite. Clara looked entirely serene. Edmund set down his fork and looked at Clara with the measured gray expression he used for most things. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. "I respect her," he said, "which I believe is a more reliable foundation than most." Clara considered this. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that's true." She picked up her fork again. "She respects you too, I think. She hasn't said so directly, but I know her well enough." Alara was looking at her soup. Edmund said nothing. But when Alara looked up a moment later, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something that was not quite warmth but was in the same territory, something that had not been present at any of the previous 21 dinners. It lasted about 3 seconds and then was gone, filed back under the composure where everything Edmund Hargrove felt seemed to live. But it had been there. Alara had seen it. She thought about it after Clara had gone to bed and she and Edmund had said goodnight in the corridor. She thought about it while the fire in the morning room burned down to embers and the house settled into its nighttime quiet around her. She thought, this is a complicated man. She thought, he is not what he appears. She thought, I have been in this house 3 weeks, and I am learning more every day. And every day I learn something new, it turns out there is more beneath it. She was not frightened by that. She was, in fact, finding it very difficult to stop thinking about it. Which was, she told herself firmly, simply the natural result of living in the same house as someone and paying close attention. That was all. She blew out the last candle and went to bed. She did not think about Edmund Hargrove any more that night. She nearly believed it. The east wing of Ashvale Manor was locked. Ilara had not noticed this immediately. The manor was large and she had been exploring it gradually, in the unhurried way that suits a person who is in no particular rush but is by nature curious. She had covered the west wing and the central rooms within the first 2 weeks. The east wing was where she had not yet gone, partly because it was further from her rooms and the morning room and the library, which had become her triangle of daily living, and partly because there had not been a reason to go there yet. The reason she went on a Tuesday afternoon in her 5th week was entirely accidental. She had been following a cat. She had not known there was a cat at Ashvale Manor. She discovered it one morning when it appeared on the windowsill of the morning room, and looked at her with the absolute confidence of an animal that belongs wherever it happens to be. It was a large, gray, serious-looking cat, and it seemed to find her presence in its window mildly acceptable, which felt like a significant achievement given the atmosphere of the house. Polly, when asked, said the cat's name was probably something, she wasn't certain what. It had been at the manor for years and nobody quite knew who it belonged to, and Ilara found this entirely believable. On the Tuesday afternoon, the cat moved out of the morning room, down the main corridor, and turned left toward the east wing. Ilara followed it the way you follow a cat, without any particular plan, simply because it had gone somewhere and she had nothing more pressing to do. She turned left down the east wing corridor and stopped. The corridor was different from the rest of the house. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The floor was the same dark wood, the ceiling the same height, but the doors on either side were all closed and the corridor had the quality of a place that was not aired out regularly. A faint difference in the air that you feel before you smell or see anything specific. The cat had sat down in the middle of the corridor and was washing its face. It seemed entirely comfortable. Ilara moved past it and walked to the first door on the left. She tried the handle. Locked. She tried the next one. Also locked. She moved down the corridor trying handles, not because she intended to go in, but because the locked quality of all of them was itself interesting, and by the time she reached the door at the end of the corridor she had tried 6 handles and all 6 were locked. The door at the end of the corridor had a small gap between the door and the frame, less than half an inch, but enough to see, in the dim afternoon light filtering through the corridor's single window, that there was something on the far side of the door, a piece of furniture, a covered shape. She stepped back. She stood in the corridor and looked at the locked door, and thought about the east wing that no one used, and the corridor that was not aired out, and the 6 doors that were all locked from the outside. She went back to the morning room. She did not mention the east wing to anyone. But she thought about it. And the following day, at dinner, she paid different attention to Edmund Hargrove. Not obvious attention. Nothing that would make him straighten slightly in that way she had begun to recognize as the way he responded to anything he perceived as scrutiny. She simply watched him more carefully. She watched the way his expression stayed the same when certain topics came up in conversation. She watched the way he answered questions about the estate's history, the family history, without ever quite moving into anything personal. She watched the way he controlled the surface of every exchange they had, politely and thoroughly, and how underneath that surface, there were doors that were all locked from the outside. It reminded her of something. It reminded her of the east wing. 2 weeks after she found the locked corridor, she went to a social gathering. It was the first one since the wedding announcement, a dinner at a house called Pembury, belonging to a Lady Wentworth who was one of those women who organize the social world with the same efficiency other people apply to commerce, who know everyone, and are known by everyone, and whose invitations are both optional and non-optional, depending entirely on whether you care about your social standing. They went together, Ilara and Edmund. They arrived in the same carriage. They entered together. Edmund introduced Ilara to people she had not met, and the people they met were uniformly courteous in that particular way that contains both welcome and assessment, and Ilara moved through the evening in her role as the Duke of Ashvale's wife, with more ease than she had expected, partly because Edmund was very good at social navigation, and partly because she was discovering, also reasonably good at it. It was at this dinner that she first heard the name Cecilia. She heard it the way you sometimes hear your own name in a crowded room, not directly addressed but snagged by some sound-gathering instinct that catches certain words without your permission. She was standing near the large fireplace talking to a pleasant older woman named Mrs. Abbott, and two men nearby were talking about something she was not listening to, and then one of them said, quite clearly, "Of course, since the Cecilia business he has been," and then his voice dropped and she lost the rest. She did not react. She continued her conversation with Mrs. Abbott about the particular difficulties of winter gardens, which Mrs. Abbott felt strongly about, and she listened to every word Mrs. Abbott said about frost-resistant plants and proper drainage, and at the same time, in the back of her mind, she was filing the word Cecilia away with the same attention she had given the East Wing. She did not ask Edmund on the ride home. She was not ready to ask. She did not know what she was asking, exactly, and she believed in knowing what question you were asking before you asked it. She asked Polly the next morning. She asked it sideways, the way you ask things when you are not sure of the landscape, she said, while Polly was arranging the fresh flowers on the morning room table. "Has the Duke always lived so quietly at the manor, or was it livelier once?" Polly was quiet for a moment. She was a young woman and she had the instinct of a young person who knows that some answers have edges. "It was different before, Your Grace," she said carefully, "before Miss Cecilia passed." "Cecilia?" Alara said, as if thinking. "A family relation?" "No, Your Grace," Polly said. She was holding the flower stems with great attention. "She was engaged to the Duke. 4 years ago now, almost." Alara let a moment pass. "What happened to her?" Polly was quiet for longer this time. "She was taken ill," she said. "She died quite suddenly. It was a very sad time." She set the flowers on the table and straightened up. "The Duke took it very hard. The whole household did." She paused. The East Wing was Miss Cecilia's favorite part of the house. He had it closed after. She left the morning room. Alara sat down in her chair by the window and looked at the gray winter garden outside and let the pieces arrange themselves. A woman named Cecilia, dead 4 years ago, engaged to Edmund. The East Wing closed. The portrait she had glimpsed through the gap in the door. She had thought it was furniture, but now she was not so sure. Now she thought perhaps it was something else. Something covered and kept and held in a room that no one went into. A man who did not talk about personal things. A house with locked doors. A grief that had made every surface of a person into a wall. She understood grief. She had watched her father die slowly over 2 years, and she had sat in the house afterwards sorting through the drawer in his study. And she had understood that grief was not simply sadness. It was also the terrible work of continuing to exist in the space where someone else no longer did. But Edmund's grief, if she was reading it correctly, had been carrying something more than loss. There was something in the locked East Wing and the closed piano lid and the 4 years of silence that felt heavier than ordinary sorrow, heavier and more complicated. She would need to be very careful here. She would need to be careful and patient and entirely unforceful, because this was not her territory, and she had not been asked to enter it, and she was not certain yet that she should. But she was also Alara Voss, who had walked into a garden in the dark with nothing but a letter in her pocket, and she had not become a different person by acquiring a new name. She thought about Edmund as she had seen him at Pembury, moving through the room with that controlled ease, speaking to people with the precise courtesy of someone who was very good at occupying a room without actually being in it. She thought about the way he had paused for half a second when she mentioned his mother and the piano. She thought about the cat in the corridor of the East Wing, washing its face as if there was nothing unusual about any of it, and she found herself wondering if the cat knew things the rest of the household didn't, the way animals sometimes did. She stood up. She had been sitting long enough. She went to the library and found a history of the county published some years before. She found Edmund Hargrove mentioned in its pages in a short paragraph, described as the heir to the Ashvale dukedom. There was nothing in the book about Cecilia, because books about counties did not generally discuss private grief. But she knew where to look now, and she was going to keep looking. Not to pry, not to expose. She had no interest in exposing anything. She had an interest in understanding the man she was living with, not the controlled public version, but the actual person underneath all those careful walls. Because she had been in this house long enough now to be certain of one thing. Edmund Hargrove was not cold. Cold things do not leave candles on desks. Cold things do not listen to dinner conversation and find books you mentioned once and mark the first page. Cold things do not stand in a ballroom and watch a stranger they have no connection to and decide that her way of handling difficulty is worth attaching a name to. Something had happened to this man. Something had happened 4 years ago and it had changed him, or changed what he showed to the world, and Alara did not yet know what that something was, But she was going to find out. She closed the book. She put it back on the shelf. Outside the library window, the winter sky pressed down gray and heavy. The manor was quiet around her. Somewhere in the east wing, behind a locked door, a covered portrait stood in the dark. And somewhere in this house, Edmund Hargrove was sitting at his desk managing his precise and orderly world, not knowing that his wife was standing in the library thinking thoughts that were beginning to tilt in a direction that had very little to do with practical arrangements or signed contracts. He would find out. Eventually. Elara put her coat on and went for a walk in the garden. She needed the cold air. She needed to clear her head. She needed to think. She walked for an hour. She did not clear her head. She thought about Edmund Hargrove the entire time. When she came back inside, flushed from the cold, there was a cup of hot tea waiting on the desk in the morning room, still warm. No note, no explanation, just the tea. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup and stared at the fire for a long time. 3 days later she heard the name again. This time it was from a man named Lord Arthur Pelham, a neighbor of Edmund's who rode over one afternoon on the pretense of discussing something about the drainage on the shared boundary of their estates, which was, Elara suspected, a very thin pretense for curiosity about the new Duchess of Ashvale. Lord Pelham was in his 50s, with a broad, frank face and the kind of straightforward manner that Elara liked on principle. He was also, she realized within 15 minutes of his arrival, someone who had known Edmund for a long time, the kind of long that includes history. Edmund was not at home when Pelham arrived. Frederick had him listed as occupied in town until the late afternoon, so it was Elara who received Lord Pelham in the drawing room, which she was beginning to claim as her own now in the way she had claimed the morning room, simply by using it. They talked about the estate, they talked about the county. Pelham asked her careful questions about herself that were genuinely interested rather than probing, and she answered them honestly, and then she asked him a careful question of her own. "How long have you known the Duke?" she asked. "Since we were boys," Pelham said. "We grew up within riding distance. He was always the same, even then, precise, serious, extraordinarily capable." He smiled. "Also entirely impossible to beat at chess." "Was he happy then?" Elara asked. Pelham looked at her. There was something in his expression that adjusted, that became more careful. "He was a more contained version of happy," he said. "Edmund has always lived inside himself. But there was a time, perhaps 4 years ago now, when he came the closest to open that I've ever seen him." He paused. "That was when he was engaged to Cecilia." Elara said nothing. She let the silence do the work, which was a technique she had discovered was very effective with people who genuinely wanted to say something. "Cecilia Brandt," Pelham said. "She was extraordinary, warm and sharp, and the kind of person who made a room better simply by being in it. They were very well matched, which surprised some people, because on the surface they seemed opposite. She was all warmth and he was all precision. But underneath, they were the same kind of person. Serious about the things that mattered. Honest. Good." He stopped. He looked at his tea. "She died in the spring," he said. "Very quickly, apparently. Edmund was with her when it happened. He was never the same afterward, which is understandable." He paused again. "I always thought there was something more to it, though. Some things he didn't say about that time." He closed up afterward in a way that went beyond grief. He looked at Elara. "I say this as someone who has known him 30 years. He closed in a way that felt like more than sadness, like guilt almost, or fear." Elara thought about this. Guilt for what? Pelham shook his head. "I don't know. He never said. And Edmund, when he doesn't say something, means not to say it." He looked at her steadily. "You're asking because you've noticed it." "I've noticed something," she said carefully. "He will not tell you easily," Pelham said. "He hasn't told anyone in 4 years, but I think, if anyone were to reach it, it would require time, and trust, and the particular patience of someone who is not frightened off by silence." He looked at her again, in that measuring way. "You do not seem easily frightened," he said. "No," she agreed, "I don't." He stayed another half hour, and then rode away, and Edmund arrived home an hour after that. They ate dinner together as usual, politely and precisely, and Edmund mentioned the boundary drainage issue with Pelham's estate, and Elara said Lord Pelham had stopped by and they had spoken briefly. Edmund asked if she had found him agreeable. She said yes, very much so. Neither of them said anything about Cecilia. But that night, alone in her room, Elara thought about what Pelham had said. Not the grief, she had understood that. Not the change in Edmund, she had seen the evidence of that. She thought about the word guilt. She thought about the word fear. She thought about a man whose fiancée had died and who had closed the entire East Wing and stopped the clock, and who, 4 years later, was still carrying something that his oldest friend described not as sadness, but as something that went deeper than sadness, something unresolved, something that had not been allowed to settle. She thought about the East Wing. She thought about the covered portrait. She thought about 6 locked doors. She got up and went to her desk and sat down and wrote nothing. She just sat there for a while. The fire was low. The house was utterly quiet. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a single line at the top of a clean sheet of paper. Not a letter to anyone, just a thought she was putting down so she could look at it. She wrote, "What is he carrying that he has never been able to put down?" She looked at the line. Then she put the pen down and went to bed. She did not yet have an answer, but she was becoming more and more certain that the answer existed, and that it was somewhere in this house, behind a locked door, waiting to be found. She was also becoming certain of something else. Something she was not entirely ready to name yet, something that had been growing quietly in the warm rooms and the careful candles, and the conversation at dinner and the books with the marked pages. Something that was neither gratitude nor respect exactly, though it contained both of those things. Something that was beginning to change the shape of how she looked at this house, of how she looked at the man she was sharing it with. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. Outside, the winter wind moved through the oak trees along the drive. The house breathed its slow, quiet breath around her. She thought, "I am going to find out what happened to Cecilia." She thought, "Not because I have any right to, but because something did happen, and Edmund is still inside it, and I am not the kind of person who stands outside a locked door and does nothing." She thought, just before she fell asleep, "I hope he lets me in." The storm arrived without warning on a Wednesday. The morning had been cold and gray, which was ordinary enough for that time of year, and Alara had been in the morning room with her tea and her book and the gray cat, which had developed a firm habit of sitting on the windowsill between 9 and 11 every morning, as if she had hired it for the position. By midday, the sky had changed. It was not the usual gray, it was a different kind, darker and lower, and the specific purple-white of winter weather that means business. By 2 in the afternoon, the first snow was falling, steady and heavy, and accompanied by a wind that came from the north and did not negotiate. By 4 o'clock, the drive was impassable. Edmund was in the house. He had been in his study all day, which was usual, but his ride into town that morning had been cancelled when Frederick checked the sky at breakfast and made one of his quiet executive decisions, and so for once, Edmund was simply in the house for the entire day, and the storm had no interest in changing that. Alara was also in the house, which was also usual, but the storm, which was now pressing against every window and filling the corridors with the sound of wind that had traveled a long way to get there, had the effect of making the house feel smaller and closer than it ordinarily did. The rooms that had felt, in fair weather, like generous space between two people who were giving each other room, now felt more like shelter shared. They met in the corridor outside the library at 5 in the afternoon, both of them apparently heading for the same place. Edmund gestured toward the library door. "After you," he said. She went in. He followed. They both stood in the library for a moment, as the wind made itself known against the old glass of the windows. And then Alara went to the chair she had claimed, and Edmund went to the desk at the far side of the room, which appeared to be where he worked when the study felt too confining. They settled into their respective corners of the room, and the evening began. This was different from dinners. At dinners there was the structure of the meal, the rhythm of courses and the format of polite conversation, and when it was over, the meal was over and they separated. In the library with the storm outside and the fire in the grate and several hours between now and any reasonable bedtime, there was no format. There was just the room. Alara read her book for a while. Edmund worked at the desk. The storm voiced itself against the windows. Mrs. Burrow sent up a tray with tea and small things to eat, which Alara poured for both of them without thinking about it. 2 cups, handing one to Edmund at the desk, and Edmund accepted it and said thank you, and they both returned to what they were doing. An hour passed like this. Alara turned her pages. Edmund's pen moved steadily. The storm got louder. It was Edmund who spoke first. "Do you find the house quiet?" he asked. He said it without looking up from his papers, in the tone of someone asking a question they have been holding for some time. Alara considered how to answer. "At first," she said, "less so now." He was quiet for a moment. He set down his pen. He picked up his tea. "Frederick tells me you've been in the library most afternoons," he said. "I like the library," she said. "It's one of the few rooms in the house that seems to have been used regularly before I got here." He looked at her. "You noticed that," he said. "I notice most things," she said. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the bookshelves on the opposite wall, which were full and organized and well-read looking. "My grandmother built this library," he said. She was the last person in this family to use every room in this house. He paused. After her, things became more selective. It was the first time he had said anything that reached toward personal history without being directly asked. Ilara kept her expression neutral. She kept her voice the same. What was she like? She asked. He thought about this. He did not answer immediately, and she could tell from the quality of his silence that he was actually thinking, not deflecting. Fierce, he said, and kind. But the fiercer thing came first, and you always knew it. She had no patience for posturing. He paused. She would have liked you, I think. Ilara looked at him. That was not a small thing to say. Why? She asked. Because you sat down at my desk and read a 3-page contract before you signed it, he said. She would have found that admirable. Most people would find that ordinary common sense, Ilara said. Most people in that situation, Edmund said, would not have been in a position to exercise common sense. They would have been too frightened, or too grateful, to read carefully. He paused. You were not frightened. Ilara considered this. I was frightened, she said. I was quite frightened, in fact. I simply decided it wasn't useful at that moment. He looked at her again with that particular attention, the way he had looked at her in the garden and in the drawing room and at various points since. The focused, assessing look that she had come to understand was not coldness but was, in fact, the way Edmund Hargrove paid close attention to things. That is an important distinction, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. The storm knocked against the window behind his desk, and they both looked at it for a moment. The glass was running with weather, and the world outside was entirely white and dark and moving. Will you tell me something? She asked. She said it carefully, because she had been thinking about how to ask something for weeks, and the storm, and the firelit library, and the quality of this conversation felt like the right moment. Possibly, he said. The East Wing, she said. He went still, not visibly, not in a way that someone watching casually would catch, but Ilara was not watching casually. What about it? He said. I walked down the corridor, she said, by accident, following the cat. I noticed it was locked. She paused. I noticed the air was different. Another pause. I noticed, through the gap in the door at the end, that the room wasn't empty. He was looking at the fire now. He had turned away from her. His jaw was set, not angrily, but in the way of someone who is deciding. You don't have to explain anything, she said, before he could say something that closed the subject. I am not asking you to. I am only telling you that I noticed, so that you know the house is not as sealed as it might seem from the inside. He turned back to look at her. There was something in his face she had not seen before, not distress exactly, more like someone standing at the edge of something they have been standing at the edge of for a long time and finding, unexpectedly, that someone else is there too. It was Cecilia's preferred part of the house, he said. I closed it after she died. She let that sit. Lord Pelham told me about her, she said, that she was extraordinary, that you were well matched. Pelham talks too much, Edmund said, but he said it without heat. He said it the way you say something about an old friend. He talked about her with great fondness, Ilara said, and he talked about the time after with great concern. She paused. He said he always felt there was something you didn't say about that time. Edmund was very still. He said it wasn't just grief, she said. She kept her voice level, not pressing, not demanding, just present. He said it looked more like guilt, or fear. The fire crackled. The storm pushed at the window. Edmund looked at the fire for a long time. Arthur Pelham, he said finally, is perceptive. Ilara said nothing. She waited. I am not ready to talk about it, Edmund said. The words were quiet and very direct and absolutely without pretense. He said them the way he said most things, precisely. But there was something underneath them that was not precision. I want to be clear that this is not because I don't trust you. You have been in this house 6 weeks and you have not once pushed where I did not invite, and I have noticed that, and I am grateful for it. He paused. But there are parts of what happened 4 years ago that I have not spoken about to anyone, and I am not yet ready. Ilara looked at him. She nodded. All right, she said simply. He looked at her. That's all? That's all, she said. You told me what you needed to. That's enough for tonight. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, it won't always be. She understood what he meant. She believed him. I know, she said. And the storm came in from the north and beat against the old glass, and the fire in the grate burned steadily, and the two of them sat in the library at Ashvale Manor on opposite sides of the room, and neither of them found any reason to leave. Frederick brought dinner to the library at 7:30, which he apparently decided was the sensible thing to do given the circumstances. He arranged it on the reading table without comment, which was one of Frederick's very best qualities. They ate facing each other across the reading table with the storm outside and the fire between them, and the conversation that had happened still present in the room the way important conversations stay present, not demanding anything, just remaining. Edmund told her about his grandmother, more than the single sentence from earlier. He told her about the library, which his grandmother had built piece by piece over 40 years. He told her about the Hargrove estate in summer, which he said was genuinely beautiful, the formal gardens and the meadow that ran down to the river, and the particular quality of the evening light at that time of year. She told him about the house she had grown up in, small and full of noise and always slightly in need of repair in one room or another, the kind of house where someone was always doing something in every room, where Clara had practiced her scales on a battered upright piano, and their mother had argued cheerfully with their father about the state of the kitchen garden, and the window in the upstairs hall had been drafty for 11 years, and was still drafty when she left. Edmund listened to all of this the way he listened to things, completely and without restlessness. "It sounds like it was alive," he said. "It was," she said. "It was a great deal of trouble, and it was always alive." He looked at his glass. "This house," he said, "has not been alive for some time." She looked at him. "It's getting there," she said. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the storm continued its business. Inside, the fire burned. The gray cat appeared from somewhere and settled on the reading table between their plates with absolute confidence, and Edmund looked at the cat with an expression that in any other face would have been called fond. "Does the cat have a name?" Elara asked. "Not officially," Edmund said. "What do you call it?" He paused. "I call it the cat," he said. "That seems insufficient." "The cat appears to disagree," he said, looking at it, and there it was again, that thing that happened occasionally at the corners of his expression, the near warmth, the almost smile, the thing that lived just underneath the composure. Elara looked at the cat. "His name is Oliver," she decided. Edmund looked at the cat. "Oliver," he said. The cat looked back at him with the satisfaction of an animal that had always known its own name and was simply waiting for the humans to figure it out. Edmund looked at Elara, and for a moment, in the lamplight with the storm outside and the fire between them and 3 glasses of good wine behind them, the expression on his face was not controlled, and it was not precise, and it was not cold. It was something much simpler, something that had been buried under 4 years of silence and locked doors and a house that had forgotten how to be lived in. It was there for only a moment, then it was back under the composure, and he said goodnight and went upstairs, and Elara sat at the table with Oliver on her lap for another half hour. But she had seen it. She was keeping count. The storm kept them inside for 5 days. They were the most unusual 5 days Elara had spent since arriving at Ashvale Manor. The structure of the house, the separate wings and separate schedules and the polite distance of the dining room, that structure softened under the pressure of a storm that made going anywhere or doing anything independently impractical. They were simply 2 people in the same rooms over and over again, with no particular occasion to manage. They ate breakfast in the morning room on the 2nd day because the dining room felt ceremonial for a Wednesday morning with snow on every windowsill. Edmund appeared in the morning room at 8, carrying his own cup, and Elara was already there, and they looked at each other for a moment, and then he sat down in the other chair and they ate together, the way people eat together when they have stopped performing, and started simply being in the same place. On the 3rd day she found him in the library before her. He was at the shelves, pulling books out, looking at the spines, putting some back and keeping others. He was, she realized as she stood in the doorway and watched, sorting them, reorganizing. He had a system. He was applying it. She sat down and said nothing and read her book and occasionally handed him a volume from the low shelf beside her chair when he pointed at it, and they reorganized the library for 2 hours without having a conversation, and it was the most comfortable morning she had spent in this house. On the 4th day it was her turn to say something that went further than she had gone before. They were in the sitting room in the afternoon because the library had gone cold and the fire there had not yet been built up, and they were sitting with the small table between them and the larger fire in the sitting room warming both their backs. "I like you," Elara said. She did not look up from her book when she said it. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him looking at her. "I like you," she said again, because she had decided to say it clearly, as a person. Not as a transaction or an arrangement, as a person. "I wanted you to know that, because I think you are in the habit of not knowing things like that, and I think that is a habit that has been bad for you. More silence. Longer this time. You are very direct, he said finally. I know, she said. It is a quality that has caused me difficulties before. I have decided to stop apologizing for it. Pause. I am not asking you to apologize. Good. She turned a page. She had not read a word of it. I don't expect you to say it back, she said. I don't expect anything. I simply wanted to say it. He was very quiet. The fire crackled. She turned another page. Ilara, he said. Her name again. He said it differently from anyone else. Carefully. Like something that mattered. I want to say something. She looked up. He was looking at the fire. I am not very good at this, he said. At being known. I have been very bad at it for a long time, and I have told myself that was by choice, which was perhaps not entirely honest. He paused. What you said to me in the library the other evening, about knowing things through noticing them, he stopped. Reorganized. I notice things too, he said. I have noticed a great deal, these past 6 weeks. She looked at him. He finally looked back at her. I think, he said, that I might be in the process of becoming a less self-sufficient person than I have been for the past 4 years, and I am not certain whether that is frightening or not. She considered this for a moment. It can be both, she said. Yes, he agreed. I think it is. They sat together in the sitting room while the 5th day of snow settled softly against the windows, and they talked. Not about anything enormous, not about Cecilia or locked doors or the East Wing. About ordinary things, about books and the estate and memories and small particular opinions about the world. But they talk the way people talk when the surface has been moved aside, and what is underneath is simply two people, genuine and present and paying attention to each other. On the 5th day the storm passed. The drive was cleared by midday. The world outside resumed its ordinary business. Edmund went to his study. Ilara went to the morning room. The house returned to its usual shape. But something had shifted. Both of them knew it. Neither of them said so, because the shift was new and needed careful handling, the way new things do. But it was there. In the way Edmund stopped in the doorway of the morning room that evening and said goodnight a different way than before. Not the precise formal goodnight of the first weeks, but something a little slower, a little more present. In the way Ilara looked up from her book and smiled. Not the polite social smile she used for people she was being courteous to, but the real one, the smaller one that meant something. The house was quiet again. But it was a different quiet now. Not the quiet of a place that had forgotten warmth. Something more like the quiet of a place that was learning to remember it. Oliver the cat sat on the windowsill in the morning room and washed his face and said nothing, which was, Ilara thought, exactly the right response. The letter fell from his coat on a Thursday. Ilara was coming down the main staircase when Edmund was crossing the entrance hall below, moving with the brisk purpose of a man on the way somewhere. She was one flight above him, which meant she saw everything clearly. The slight stumble of his step on the marble, the way the letter slipped from the breast pocket of his coat, the way it fell and landed face up on the floor in a patch of afternoon light. He did not notice. He was already through the far door. She heard it close behind him. She came the rest of the way down the stairs. She stood on the bottom step and looked at the letter lying on the entrance hall floor, face up in the light. She could see that it was addressed to him. She could see, at the upper left of the envelope, the return name, a name she did not recognize. She could see nothing else from where she stood. She walked across the hall. She picked up the letter by its edges. She turned it face down without reading the front more carefully than she already had, because she had made the decision not to read it in the time it took to cross the hall and reach it. She placed it on the entrance hall table and went to find Frederick. She told Frederick there was a letter on the table that the Duke had dropped. Frederick thanked her and went to collect it. She went back to the morning room. She sat down. She thought about the brief, involuntary glimpse she had had of the return name on the envelope. She had not recognized it at first, but the more she sat with it, turning the letters over in her memory, the more it began to resolve into something familiar. Not familiar from personal knowledge, familiar from the newspapers, from the court pages, from the list of names that appeared in connection with a particular sphere of wealth and power that operated at a level above most of ordinary society. The name was Draven. As in Lord Gregory Draven, who was the head of one of the oldest and most politically connected families in the country, whose influence extended into Parliament and out again, whose family money came from sources that were not usually discussed in precise terms and whose social position had never been successfully challenged in living memory. Ilara did not know why Lord Gregory Draven would be writing to her husband. She did not know what the letter said. She had not read it, and she had no intention of finding out what was in it through any channel other than Edmund telling her himself. But the name sat in her mind with a particular weight that she could not entirely account for. She had been paying attention, these past weeks, to the outlines of things in this house, to the shape of what was not said, to the locked doors and the covered portraits, and the thing Pelham had called guilt and fear rather than grief alone. The name Draven arriving by letter, landing on the floor, and Edmund not being aware it had fallen, all of this arranged itself in the back of Alara's mind, into a pattern she could not yet fully see, but could feel taking shape. She was still sitting with that feeling when Edmund came back through the entrance hall an hour later. She heard him stop at the table. She heard the sound of the letter being picked up, then silence. The hall was directly accessible from the morning room, separated only by the open archway, and she was sitting close enough to the door to hear the silence clearly. It was not an ordinary silence. She had learned Edmund's silences the way you learn the sounds of a house you live in, the specific weight of each one. She had the silence of concentrated work, which had a quality of momentum, the silence of reading, which had a quality of following, the silence of stopping at the morning room door in the evenings, which had a quality of intention. This silence had a quality she had not heard before. It was the silence of something landing very hard in a very still place. She got up. She went to the archway. Edmund was standing at the hall table with the letter in his hands. He had not opened it. He was holding it. His face was turned slightly away from her, but she could see enough of his expression to know that this was not a normal piece of correspondence. His jaw was set. His hands were very still. He was the most still she had ever seen him, and Edmund Hargrove was a man who was almost always still. It was different this time. This stillness was not composure. It was something composure was covering. She stepped into the hall. He heard her and looked up. He was in control again within a second. The expression adjusted. The letter moved to his side. But the second before that adjustment had happened, she had seen what was underneath it. It was fear. She was certain of it. The first time she had ever seen Edmund Hargrove afraid. "I found that on the floor," she said. "You dropped it when you left. I had Frederick put it on the table." He looked at her. "Did you read it?" he asked. He said it directly, without accusation, simply asking. "No," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding how to read her answer, checking it against his understanding of her, and she stood still and let him check, because she had nothing to hide, and he was allowed to look. "Thank you," he said quietly. He said it the same way he had said it the first time, when she had returned a different letter in the drawing room at the townhouse. But it was different now. They were different now. The 6 weeks between those two moments had not been ordinary time. They had been the particular kind of time that changes people, slowly, without announcing itself. She almost said, "What does Draven want?" She almost said, "You can tell me." She almost said, "I have been watching you carry something for weeks and I think I know the shape of it and I think I might be able to help." She said none of these things, because he had said, in the library on the storm's first night, that he was not yet ready to talk about it, and she had said, "All right," and she had meant it. "Good night," she said instead. It was 5 in the afternoon, not evening, and they both knew it, but the word meant what it meant. He understood. She could see that he understood. She went back to the morning room. She heard him stand in the hall for another minute. Then she heard his footsteps going toward his study. The door opened and closed. Alara sat down. She picked up her book. She put it back down. She stared at the fire for a while. She thought about Lord Gregory Draven. She thought about what would make Edmund Hargrove afraid. She thought about Cecilia, dead 4 years ago, quickly apparently. She thought about Pelham's word, guilt. She thought about Pelham's other word, fear. She thought about the letter. And then, because she had trained herself in this house to move carefully and think before speaking, she thought about the fact that she had a name now, Draven. And names, if you knew where to look, told you things. She was going to look. She was careful about how she did it. She was not going to search Edmund's papers or question his staff or do anything that crossed the line from concern into intrusion. But she was a woman who read broadly and paid close attention and had spent several weeks in an excellent library, and there were other ways to learn things. She spent the following morning in the library with a selection of newspapers from the past 5 years, which were kept in bound volumes on the lower shelves, the kind of thing a household like this kept routinely, and no one much looked at. She told herself she was reading generally. She was reading very specifically. The name Draven appeared in those pages more often than she had expected, mostly in political columns, attached to parliamentary matters, the usual kind of mention. But twice in 5 years there were references to a legal dispute involving the Draven family, a property matter, something to do with entitlements and contested rights in a northern county. The dispute appeared to have been settled out of court both times. The terms were not disclosed. Once, 4 years ago, there was a small item in the court pages about a dinner hosted by Lord Draven at which various names appeared, including Cecilia Brandt, described as a guest. Ilara read that item 3 times. It proved nothing. It was a dinner. Cecilia Brandt had been a person in society, and society people attended dinners. But the date of the item was 3 months before Cecilia died, and the dinner had been at Draven's principal estate, which meant that Cecilia had been in the same house as Gregory Draven within the last season of her life. Ilara folded the newspaper carefully and put it back in its volume, and replaced the volume on the shelf. She sat at the library table and thought. She did not yet know what she knew. She had a name, a date, a dinner, and a letter that had made Edmund afraid. She had a fiancé who had died quickly. She had a locked east wing. She had 4 years of silence. She had no proof of anything. She had no story. She had fragments. But fragments were what you started with, always. You gathered fragments until they made a shape, and then you looked at the shape and you understood what had happened. She had learned this not from any formal training but from a year of sitting in her father's study sorting through the drawer of debts and piecing together a life she had not known her father was living. You learned things piece by piece. You kept gathering until the picture was complete. She was not finished gathering, but she was further along than she had been a week ago. She went to dinner that evening. Edmund was there, composed and precise as always, and she looked at him across the table and he looked at her, and the thing that had happened between them these past weeks was still present in the space between them, the warmth and the watching, and the almost things that had accumulated slowly and carefully. But tonight there was also something else. She could see it around the edges of his eyes, a tension that had not been there before the letter. He was managing it well. He was managing it perfectly, in fact, if you were not paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. "Are you well?" she asked, during a pause between the soup and what came after. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "You can tell me if you're not," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know that," he said. And the way he said it told her that he did in fact know it, and that knowing it was something relatively new, and something he was not entirely certain what to do with. "Good," she said. She picked up her fork. "The lamb is excellent tonight," she said. "Mrs. Burrow has outdone herself." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Yes, she has." And they ate dinner, and the conversation moved through its ordinary channels, and underneath it, the letter was there, and the name Draven was there, and whatever Edmund was carrying, that he was not yet ready to put down was there, present and patient, waiting for the moment he was finally ready to hand it to someone. Ilara thought, looking at her plate. "I will be here when that moment comes," she thought. "I am not going anywhere," she thought, with a certainty she had not felt about anything in a very long time. "Whatever is behind those locked doors, we will face it together. He does not know that yet, but he will." She ate her lamb. Edmund ate his. Oliver appeared from under the table and was firmly but gently relocated to the corridor by Frederick. Outside, the winter pressed on. Inside, the fire burned. And in the entrance hall, on the corner of Edmund's desk where he had placed it after coming back from his study, the letter from Lord Gregory Draven sat closed and unopened still. Edmund had not been able to make himself open it yet. He would have to. He knew he would have to. The contents of that letter were not the kind of thing that could be avoided indefinitely. The man who had written it was not the kind of man who sent letters for reasons that could be ignored. But not tonight. Tonight, he needed one more evening of the thing that had been quietly building in this house, the thing he could not fully name yet, the thing that sat across the dinner table from him, and asked if he was well, and meant it. Just one more evening of that, before he opened the letter, and whatever was inside it changed everything. He opened it the next morning. He sat at his desk at 6:45, before Frederick arrived, before the house properly woke, and he held the letter in both hands, and looked at the sealed edge of it, and felt the particular weight of a thing he had been avoiding for 4 years, settling back down onto his shoulders, as though it had never left. It had never left, of course. He knew that. He had simply become very practiced at carrying it in a way that did not show. He opened the envelope. The letter was short, 6 lines. The handwriting was expensive and even, and gave no indication of anything in its formation, which was itself a kind of message. Men like Gregory Draven wrote letters that said nothing threatening and meant everything threatening, and they knew you understood the difference, and the understanding was the point. The 6 lines said that Lord Draven hoped Edmund was well and congratulated him on his recent marriage. They said that Draven had heard, through the ordinary channels of things being heard, that certain documents Edmund possessed had recently been in motion again, moved from their previous location to a new one, They said that Draven believed, as he had always believed, that a matter which had been put to rest some years ago was best left resting, and that disturbing it again would benefit no one, most particularly no one's new wife, who could not, after all, have been expecting to inherit someone else's difficulty. That was the end of the letter. Edmund sat at his desk for a very long time. Then he folded the letter, put it in the locked drawer of his desk, and sat for another 10 minutes doing nothing at all. Draven knew the documents had been moved. That meant Draven had someone watching. That meant the careful, quiet work Edmund had been doing for 4 years, slowly and patiently building a case out of fragments, was visible to the person it was meant to expose. That meant the plan was compromised. That also meant Ilara was mentioned in the letter, which meant Draven was looking at her, which meant the situation had changed completely. He had done this to her, not deliberately, not knowingly, but he had brought her into his house, into his name, into his life, without telling her what was underneath that life. He had told himself, when he made the offer in the garden, that the secret was his to carry and had nothing to do with her, that marrying her would not pull her into his danger because the danger was old and quiet, and he was managing it carefully. He had been wrong, or Draven had moved faster than expected. Either way, the result was the same. She was named in a threatening letter. She had not been warned. She did not know. He pulled the drawer open again and looked at the letter. 6 lines. Her name implied in the third-to-last sentence, the unmistakable message of a man who wanted Edmund to understand that no one around him was outside the circle of what could be touched. Edmund closed the drawer. He stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the manor grounds in the early morning light, white and still and entirely peaceful, the way things look when they do not know what is coming. He thought about going to Ilara immediately. He thought about sitting across from her at the breakfast table and telling her everything, the whole of it. Cecilia and the evidence and Draven and the years of careful, invisible work, all of it laid out plainly the way Edmund preferred to lay things out. He did not do it, not because he was hiding from her, but because he needed to think first, to understand the shape of the situation, to know what he was asking her to enter before he asked her to enter it. He needed to be precise. He owed her precision at minimum, and he believed he owed her considerably more than that. He sat back down at his desk. He picked up his pen. He began to think. The documents Draven referenced were real. Edmund had spent 4 years gathering them, piece by piece, thread by thread, from sources that Draven would have considered safely buried. What Draven did not know, what no one knew, was that Edmund had not kept those documents at Ashvale Manor. He had moved them, months ago, to a location that no connection of Draven's would think to look. The move had apparently not been as invisible as Edmund had believed, but the destination was still secure. For now. He also thought about the witness. There was one person who had been present on the night Cecilia died, who had seen what happened and had been told, in terms that left her no choice, to be silent about it. Edmund had found her 18 months after Cecilia's death, living under a different name in a town in the north of the country. She had been too frightened to speak then. He had not pressed her. He had checked on her regularly since, through Frederick, indirectly, carefully. She was still there. She was still afraid. But she was the key. Without her testimony, the documents were suggestive but not sufficient. With her testimony, the documents became proof. Edmund stared at his desk. He thought about Cecilia. He thought about her in the way he allowed himself to think about her, which was carefully, and with the kind of grief that had learned to stay in its lane, not spilling into everything else the way it had in the first year. He thought about the night he had understood what had happened and what it meant. He thought about the years after that, the slow work, the locked east wing, the closed piano, the decision to make himself unavailable to people in the ordinary ways because he could not carry both the grief and the performance of normalcy at the same time. He thought about Ilara. He thought about her reading the contract. He thought about her in the morning room with the moved chair and the books on the windowsill, making the room hers by simply living in it. He thought about the library during the storm and the way she had said "I like you" in the sitting room without any of the calculations or performances that such a sentence usually involved. He thought about the way she had looked at him last night across the dinner table and asked if he was well and held his gaze, not pushing, just present. He thought about her name in Draven's letter. He stood up again. He crossed his study to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. He had been managing this alone for 4 years, and he had been, by most measures, successful at the managing. But success at carrying something alone is not the same as the situation being properly handled, and Edmund was honest enough, at 6:50 in the morning in his study with the letter locked in his drawer, to admit that he had been carrying this alone, not only because it was safer that way, but also because he had not, until recently, had anyone he trusted enough to carry it with him. He thought, I trust her. He had not expected to. He had not planned to. He had offered her a transaction, and it had become something different, and he was still understanding what that something different was, and that process of understanding was itself something he had not done in a very long time. But he trusted her. He was certain of it in the way he was certain of very few things, in the way you know a thing that you have been testing carefully for weeks and that has not given way under the pressure of the testing. He would tell her. Not today, because today he needed to think more carefully about how to tell her and what the telling meant for her safety, but soon, he would tell her, and then they would figure out the rest of it together. He opened the study door. The corridor was quiet. The house was beginning to wake around him, the smell of the kitchen coming up from downstairs, the distant sound of someone opening shutters in the east wing. He stopped. The east wing. He stood very still in the corridor and listened. Someone was in the east wing, opening shutters, which meant someone had a key to the east wing that Edmund had not given out, and that key had been used this morning, and the shutters that had been closed for 4 years were being opened. He walked to the east wing corridor. He turned the corner. The corridor was exactly as it had always been, dim and still. But at the far end, light was coming from under the door he had kept locked for 4 years, the door that was now slightly ajar. He walked to it. He pushed it open. Frederick was inside, opening the last shutter of the room. The morning light came in thin and clean across the dust-sheeted furniture and the covered portrait on the far wall, and the stopped clock above the fireplace. Frederick turned when he heard the door. He looked at Edmund without surprise. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment and was glad it had arrived. "I thought it was time, Your Grace," Frederick said simply. Edmund stood in the doorway of the room he had locked 4 years ago and looked at the light coming in from windows that had been dark for all that time. He thought about Alara. He thought about what she had said in the library. "It is getting there." He stepped into the room. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." Edmund told her on a Friday evening in February. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular occasion that forced it. He had simply arrived at the conclusion that it was time, and Edmund, once he arrived at a conclusion, acted on it. She was in the library. He came in and sat in the chair across from hers, which he had been doing more often lately, and she looked up from her book, and something in the way he settled into the chair told her that this was not the ordinary coming in, that something was different in the quality of his stillness. She set her book down. She waited. He told her about Cecilia. He told her from the beginning, from the time they had met at a gathering 3 years before her death, when Cecilia had been 24 and Edmund had been 31, and they had stood at opposite ends of a formal dinner table and argued about the reform of land inheritance law for 45 minutes, and Edmund had gone home afterward, unable to remember the last time he had enjoyed a conversation that much. He told her how it had developed slowly, because everything between them moved slowly. They were both careful people, and then how it had come clear, to both of them at the same time, that this was real and serious, and something neither of them had been expecting and both of them wanted. He told her about the engagement. He told her about the way the house had been during that time, the East Wing, the music room, the life that had been assembling itself around those two people who were planning a future together. He told her about the dinner at Draven's estate, which Cecilia had attended because she and Lady Draven had been acquainted through a mutual connection. He told her about the way Cecilia had come home from that dinner with something wrong in her face, something she would not explain immediately, only saying it was nothing and she was tired. He told her about the following weeks, about Cecilia growing quieter, about the letters she received that she did not share with him, about the afternoon she finally told him what had happened at the Draven estate. Not something that could be spoken plainly in that time, not something that was given a clear and honest name by the world, but something that had been done to her at that house by Gregory Draven on the night of the dinner, when she had been separated from the other guests and found herself alone with a man who had decided that his position meant he could take what he wanted. Edmund stopped speaking for a moment when he reached this part. He looked at his hands on the arms of the chair. His face was very controlled, and underneath the control there was something that had not been controlled in 4 years and was moving now, slowly, like a river in thaw. He continued. Cecilia had told him. She had been ashamed, which was wrong, and he had told her so, but she had still felt it. The way people feel things they have been trained to feel regardless of whether those feelings make sense. She had been frightened of Draven, of what he would do if she told anyone else. Edmund had been, for the first and last time in his adult life, completely unprepared. He had felt things that went far beyond the range of what he usually felt, enormous things, and he had made promises to Cecilia that he meant and that he intended to keep. He had begun to gather evidence, quietly and carefully, in the particular way he gathered everything. He had found 2 other women who had been hurt by Draven in similar circumstances, both of whom were too frightened to speak publicly, but who were willing to provide written statements to Edmund that he kept in a locked box. He had found financial records that connected Draven to the suppression of a previous complaint by a young woman from a family without power or money. He had been building a case. And then Cecilia had died. She had become ill in early spring. The illness was sudden and the doctors were uncertain about it, which in retrospect was itself something to notice, because Cecilia had been healthy and young and there was no reasonable explanation for the swiftness of what happened to her. But Edmund at the time had been sitting by her bed, and grief had not been a time for clear thinking, and the world had simply told him that she was ill, and then that she was gone, and he had not questioned it in the moment because the moment was not one in which questions lived. The question came later, 3 months after her death, when Edmund received, through a chain of intermediaries that eventually reached him in the form of a short anonymous note, the information that the household staff at Draven's principal estate had been dismissed and replaced entirely in the weeks immediately following Cecilia's dinner there, all of them, at once, with generous severance and the kind of arrangement that meant they would not speak about the circumstances of their dismissal. Edmund had read that note and sat very still for a long time. He had started looking again, more carefully. He found the woman named Agnes, who had been a housemaid at Draven's estate and who was now living in the north under a different name with a younger sister, and a very strong preference for not being found. Edmund had found her because he was Edmund Hargrove, and finding things was what he was best at. He had visited her once, personally, making certain to come alone and to make it very clear to her that she was not in any danger from him. She had been frightened regardless, the kind of frightened that had settled into a person's bones from a long time of being frightened, and she had not been able to speak about what she had seen at Draven's estate in the weeks surrounding Cecilia's death, but she had not denied that there was something to speak about. Edmund had kept her address. He had checked on her through Frederick every 2 months. He had kept building the case around the fragments he could find, because the fragments were pointing at something, and he could not prove what they were pointing at, and he could not put it down. Elara listened to all of this without interrupting. She sat in the library chair with her hands in her lap, and she kept her face steady not because she was not feeling anything, but because the feelings were large and complicated, and this was not the time for them. This was the time to listen, to take in everything Edmund was saying, carefully and completely, so that she understood the whole of it before she responded to any part. He finished. He was quiet. The fire was lower than it had been when he started. He had been talking for a long time. She let a moment pass. "The documents," she said, "the ones Draven mentioned in his letter, where are they?" He looked at her sharply, then his expression adjusted. "You saw the name on the envelope," he said. "I saw the name," she agreed. "I didn't read the letter." "The documents," he said, "are in a secure location outside the estate. Is Agnes still safe?" He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she had come to recognize as him noticing something and deciding what to do with having noticed it. "Yes," he said, "as far as I know." "And Draven's letter," she said. "What did it actually say?" He told her. He told her the 6 lines, the precise language, the name at the end. She was very quiet when he finished. "He mentioned me," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment more. "He wants you to stop. He wants me to understand," Edmund said carefully, "that there are things within his reach that I care about." She absorbed this. "He thinks that will work." "It has worked," Edmund said. "For 4 years it has worked. Because for 4 years there was nothing in my life he could threaten that would affect my behavior. The estate is not a threat. Money is not a threat." He paused. "He has presumably been watching long enough to understand that the situation has changed." Elara looked at him. He looked back. They were both very still. "So he has identified me as a vulnerability," she said. "He believes so," Edmund said. She turned this over. She looked at the fire. Then she looked back at Edmund and said, quite directly, "He is wrong." Edmund blinked. Just once. "I understand that he is dangerous," she said. "I understand that he has power and reach, and that what he did to Cecilia, and what he appears to have done afterward, is the kind of thing that very powerful men get away with, because the people around them are afraid." She paused. "I am not afraid of Gregory Draven." "You haven't met him," Edmund said. "That's true," she agreed. "But I have spent most of the past year managing things that frightened me, and I have learned that fear is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to be careful." She looked at him steadily. "And you have been carrying this alone for 4 years. That ends now." Edmund looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that goes through the surface of things. "You understand what you're saying," he said. "I understand exactly what I'm saying," she said. I am saying that you are not managing this by yourself anymore. I am saying that we look at what you have, together, and we decide together what the next step is. She paused. I am also saying that Agnes needs to know she is not alone, which I think might matter more than any document. He was very quiet. He looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. Why? He asked. And he meant it as a genuine question, not a deflection. He wanted to understand. She thought about how to answer. Because Cecilia deserved someone to do this for her, she said. And because the women he has hurt since her deserve it. And because you have been carrying it alone for 4 years, and that is long enough. She paused. And because I am your wife, she said, and those are not just words on paper. Edmund said nothing for a long moment. The fire settled in the grate. Oliver the cat appeared from his usual place under Ilara's chair, and moved to the hearthrug and sat down. There is more, Edmund said finally. More that I haven't told you. I know, she said. He looked at her. Tell me, she said. He told her about the afternoon he had stood outside the room where Cecilia was dying. He told her about the doctor who had been brought by Draven's associate, a man Edmund had not known and whom he had, in his grief, simply allowed to enter and attend because in that moment he had not been thinking clearly enough to question it. He told her about the medication the doctor had administered. He told her about looking, afterward, when it was too late, and the looking was only for the purpose of understanding what had been done, and finding that the medication had been wrong for what Cecilia was said to be suffering from and right, in a different and terrible way, for a different outcome. He told her this without his voice changing. He had told himself this story so many times in 4 years that it had become something he could carry in his hands without dropping it. But his hands, on the arms of the chair, were white at the knuckles. Ilara looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She stood up from her chair and moved across the library and sat down on the arm of his chair and put her hand over one of his. He went very still. I know, she said quietly, that this is not the kind of arrangement you planned for. He looked up at her. Neither did I, she said, but here we are. He turned his hand under hers. He held it. She let him hold it. They sat like that for a while, in the library at Ashvale Manor, the fire burning low, and the winter pressing quietly at the windows, and the gray cat on the hearthrug watching them both with the ancient patience of an animal that has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. Outside, the night was deep and cold and entirely still. Inside, something that had been locked for 4 years was slowly beginning to open. They stayed in the library for 2 more hours that night. Edmund talked more than she had ever heard him talk, which was not a flood but was steady. And she understood that it was steady because he had been holding it for a long time, and now it was moving at the pace that long-held things move when they are finally allowed to. She asked questions when questions were useful, and was quiet when quiet was useful, and she did not once say anything that was meant to comfort but was not true. He appreciated that more than any comfort would have been. He had always disliked being comforted with things that were not honest. He told her about Frederick's role, which had been larger than most people knew. Frederick had been the one who made contact with Agnes. Frederick had been the one who managed the secure location of the documents, traveling personally twice a year to verify their condition. Frederick had been keeping the case alive through the years when Edmund himself had been too close to the grief to do it. He's very loyal, Ilara said. He knew Cecilia, Edmund said. He liked her a great deal. She nodded. Does he know you've told me? He'll know in the morning, Edmund said. He will be relieved. Will he? She said. He has been suggesting, in the particular way that Frederick suggests things, which is by simply doing them and waiting to see if I stop him, that it was time. He paused. Opening the east wing shutters was not subtle. She smiled. He did not miss it. He looked at her smile the way he looked at things he had decided mattered. What do you think the next step should be? She asked. He had been thinking about this since the morning, since the letter really. He had been turning the problem over with the part of his mind that was always turning problems over, and he had arrived at something. Agnes needs to be brought somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere Draven cannot find her, which means somewhere that cannot be connected to me through any obvious channel. He paused. And she needs to know that if she speaks, she will be believed and protected. She needs to meet someone who is not frightening, Ilara said. He looked at her. She has been in contact only with you and with Frederick, I assume, she said, both of whom are associated with the Duke of Ashvale, which is a name that comes with weight. She needs someone who is not weight. He was quiet for a moment. Are you suggesting yourself? I am suggesting, Ilara said carefully, that a woman who grew up in an ordinary house without particular power, and who has been frightened herself and managed it anyway, might be less frightening to speak to than either of you. She paused. I am also suggesting that you could not take me to meet her without it looking like a deliberate move that Draven's people would notice. I would have to go on my own. He looked at her for a long time. The fire was low. The library was dim. No, he said. She looked at him without argument. Not yet, he said, which was different. Not until I understand how closely Draven's people are watching. If they have been watching this house for long enough to know the documents were moved, they may be watching closely enough to follow you. He paused. I will not put you in the path of something I have not first understood clearly. She looked at him. She understood. All right, she said. Then what first? First, he said, I need to understand exactly what Draven knows about the documents, which means I need to backtrack the information chain that allowed him to know they were moved. He paused, which means I need to find out which of the 4 people who knew about the move told someone who ended up telling Draven. She absorbed this. You think one of the 4 is connected to him? I think it is the most likely explanation, he said. I don't want to think it, but it is the most likely. She nodded. And Frederick is one of the 4. Frederick is one of the 4, he confirmed, which is why I have not yet told Frederick what I am planning. She understood the weight of that. Edmund not telling Frederick meant Edmund was, for the first time, doing this part without the person who had been helping him for 4 years. That was a different kind of alone. You're telling me instead, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said simply. It was the simplest thing he had said all evening, and it landed the heaviest. She did not make anything of it. She simply said, Then I'll help you think it through. They talked until nearly midnight. Not dramatically, not urgently, with the calm focus of 2 people who are both naturally good at solving problems, and have found, unexpectedly, that they are solving this one together. They worked through the chain of information about the document move. They identified the 4 people who had known. They discussed Draven's methods of intelligence gathering, which Edmund knew more about than he might have wished to. They discussed Agnes, her location, her situation, what it would take to make her feel safe enough to speak. When they finally went upstairs, the house was very quiet around them. They stopped at the corridor that divided their wings, the same spot where they had said goodnight every evening for 2 months. And this time the goodnight was different from all the others. Edmund held her hand for a moment. Just a moment. Just the brief warm pressure of it. Thank you, he said. And then he said more quietly, I should have told you sooner. You told me when you were ready, she said. That was the right time. He looked at her. He said nothing, but the looking said things. She had been learning to read it for 2 months, and she read it now. She said goodnight. She went to her wing. She lay in her bed in the dark with the warmth of his hand still present in hers and the fire low in the grate, and the whole enormous weight of what she had learned tonight settling slowly into place. Cecilia had deserved better. The women after Cecilia had deserved better. Agnes, alone in the north under a different name and a different life, deserved better. Alara lay still in the dark and felt the shape of what she was part of now, the shape of it, and it was large and it was serious, and it had real danger in it. She was not frightened exactly, but she was clear-eyed, and being clear-eyed about something dangerous is not the same as not feeling its weight. She felt its weight. She also felt something else. Something she had been feeling for weeks and had not named yet. Something that had begun in the cold garden and grown quietly through every morning room morning and every library evening and every good night in the corridor, that had become undeniable tonight in the chair with her hand over his white knuckles. She did not try to name it now. She had enough for one night. She closed her eyes. Outside, the winter lay across the grounds of Ashvale Manor without sound. The east wing shutters that Frederick had opened that morning let in the night air for the first time in 4 years. Tomorrow there was work to do. There were careful, dangerous problems to think through clearly. Tonight, there was only the quiet, and the fire, and the particular feeling of not being alone. The name that broke the chain open was not what Edmund expected. He had spent 3 days working backward through the information about the document move, tracing each piece of it with the same careful attention he gave to everything, asking himself at each step who had known what, and when, and who they might have spoken to. The chain was not long. The move had been planned with minimal involvement on purpose, precisely because Edmund had never fully trusted the security of the situation even when it felt stable. 4 people had known the location of the new archive: Edmund himself, Frederick, a solicitor named William Hatch who had helped arrange the leased space, and a man named Rowan Peel who owned the building in question and had been paid generously for both his space and his silence. Edmund eliminated himself immediately. Frederick he was deeply reluctant to eliminate, not because he suspected Frederick but because he could not afford to assume. William Hatch had been Edmund's solicitor for 8 years and had handled enough of his private business to know that discretion was not optional. Rowan Peel Edmund knew less well, but the man's livelihood depended on the trust of the people who used his building for private storage, and there was no obvious connection between Peel and Draven's world. He began with Hatch. He did not ask Hatch directly. He approached it sideways, the way he approached most things, by asking Hatch to review a piece of documentation related to the archive that required a visit to the location. He accompanied Hatch on this visit. During the visit, he asked Hatch a question that he had phrased very carefully, a question about whether Hatch had recently received any correspondence from parties Edmund had not introduced him to. Hatch answered immediately and without hesitation, and the answer was no, and Edmund believed him, because Edmund had been watching Hatch's face very closely, and the answer had the texture of truth. He eliminated Hatch. He visited Peel next. This visit was less indirect because Peel was not a man with whom indirection worked well. Peel was a blunt person who appreciated bluntness in return, and Edmund asked him a blunt question. Peel answered it, and in the course of the answer gave Edmund a piece of information that had not been part of the question, which was that a man had come to the building 6 weeks ago claiming to be a property inspector, and had asked to see the occupancy records for the floor on which Edmund's archive was located. Peel had turned him away, but the visit had happened, and the timing was 3 weeks before Draven's letter. Edmund thanked Peel and left. He stood on the street outside the building and thought, a property inspector. Draven's reach included enough people in enough official-seeming positions that this was not surprising. What it told Edmund was that Draven had known, before the visit, that the archive existed and was in that building, which meant someone had told him where it was before he sent anyone to verify. Which meant someone in the chain had told him the building name and the general location without necessarily telling him the room or the details, and then Draven had sent someone to narrow it further. He went back to Frederick, not to accuse. He trusted Frederick with everything, and this situation did not change that. He went back to Frederick because Frederick was the one person who might have mentioned the archive, innocently, without understanding what he was saying, in some context that Edmund had not been aware of. He sat down with Frederick that evening, in the study, and he explained what he had learned from Peel. He asked Frederick, as directly as possible, whether Frederick could account for every conversation he had had in the past 6 months that touched on the archive. Frederick was quiet for a long time. He looked at something just past Edmund's shoulder, which was what Frederick did when he was thinking very carefully. Then Frederick said, "The nephew." Edmund went very still. Frederick continued. He said that he had a nephew, a young man named George who lived in London and who was in some financial difficulty. Frederick had been helping George for 2 years, small amounts, steady. George had come to visit Frederick at the manor 3 months ago, the kind of visit that was not unusual, and that Edmund would not have particularly noted. During the visit, Frederick had driven George back to the station in the estate carriage. In the carriage, George had asked Frederick a question about the estate's finances, the kind of question that might come from a nephew who was struggling and was trying to understand whether there were legitimate paths to help. Frederick had answered generally, reassuringly, and in the course of answering had mentioned that certain documents were stored off-site for security, and had named, without thinking, the street where the building was. Frederick stopped. He looked at Edmund directly now. "I did not think anything of it," Frederick said. "It was a general remark. I did not specify what was stored or what its significance was. I mentioned a street." He paused. "I should not have said even that much." Edmund looked at Frederick. Frederick looked back at him with the expression of a man who has found something very wrong in his own behavior and is not trying to minimize it. "George," Edmund said, "is he in contact with anyone connected to Draven?" "I did not know to ask," Frederick said. "I will find out." Edmund nodded. "Do it carefully," he said, "and when you have found out, tell me, and no one else." Frederick nodded. He stood up to leave. At the door he stopped. "I am sorry," he said. "You trusted me with this for 4 years and I made a mistake." "You mentioned a street to your nephew," Edmund said. "You did not know what you were giving him. Whatever he did with it is on him." He paused. "Find out what he did with it, and then we will know what we're dealing with." Frederick left. Edmund sat at his desk. He went and found Alara in the morning room. She was at the desk, writing. She looked up when he came in. He told her what Frederick had said. She listened to all of it. She did not react with alarm. She processed it the way she processed most things, with the still, focused attention that he had come to think of as one of her most important qualities. "So Draven has had the street for 3 months, she said, "which means he has had time to investigate the building and the occupants." "Yes," Edmund said, "which means he may know more than the letter suggested." "Possibly," he said. She was quiet for a moment. And the documents themselves. Even if he knows the building, does he know what specifically is there? No, Edmund said. The lease is not in my name. The room has no identification on it. He knows documents exist somewhere in that building. He does not know which room or what their content is. But he knows they exist, she said, which was the point of the letter. He knows you have been building something. Yes, Edmund said. She looked at her hands on the desk. Then, the question is not whether to stop, she said. The question is how quickly to move. He looked at her. What do you mean? She looked up at him. Draven is nervous, she said. He would not send a threatening letter if he were entirely confident. A confident man ignores a problem. A nervous man warns. She paused. If you move quickly enough, before he understands the full extent of what you have, you change the situation from one where he is watching, and you are building, to one where the thing has already been presented, and cannot be taken back. Edmund sat down in the chair across from the desk. He looked at her. Present it to whom? He said. That, she said, is what we need to figure out. It was the question Edmund had been turning over for 4 years. The presentation of the evidence was the problem he had never entirely solved. Draven was too powerful to be brought before the ordinary channels without those channels simply routing back to him. The legal system was available in theory and unavailable in practice. Certain newspaper editors would print the story if the evidence was solid enough, but printing without Agnes's testimony was a risk, because Draven would deny it and have the resources to do so loudly and effectively. He needed Agnes, and he needed whoever would receive the evidence to be both powerful enough to matter and independent enough of Draven that they could not be bought or warned off before the thing reached its conclusion. Elara was quiet for a long time. She was thinking. He could see it, working through something with the systematic patience she brought to everything. My cousin, she said finally. He looked at her. My mother's cousin, she said. He is a magistrate in the Northern District. He is 63 years old and entirely without ambition for anything beyond his work, which makes him the specific kind of person Draven cannot bribe, because there is nothing Draven has that he wants. She paused. He is also the most scrupulously fair person I have ever known. He has no connection to Draven's circle. He has no social debt to anyone who would benefit from this being suppressed. Edmund was quiet. His name is Vincent Howell, she said. He is in Northbourne, which is also, unless I am misremembering, roughly where you said Agnes is living. Edmund stared at her. You know where Northbourne is. I grew up knowing Vincent, she said. He used to send us game from his grounds in the autumn. We spent a summer there when I was 9. She paused. He would do this, if asked properly, and given proper evidence. He is exactly the kind of man who would. Edmund sat very still. He had spent 4 years looking for the right recipient for the evidence he was building, the person powerful enough to matter, and independent enough to be uncorruptible. And that person had apparently been Elara's mother's cousin the entire time. How well does he know you? Edmund asked. Well enough that a letter from me would be taken seriously, she said. Well enough that a visit from me would be received. She looked at him. I could write to him today. He thought about the timeline. He thought about Draven's letter and the nervous quality of it, the warning that was also a measure of how much had been built already. He thought about Agnes in the north, and Vincent Howell in Northbourne, and the documents in the building on the street Frederick had named. He thought about Elara, who had been in his house for 2 months, who had read a 3-page contract before signing it, who had made the morning room hers by living in it, who had sat in the library during a storm and told him she liked him like it was a simple fact that needed saying, who had put her hand over his in this same room on a different evening and said those are not just words on paper. He thought, I have been in this alone for 4 years and I am no longer alone. He thought, she is remarkable. He had been thinking it for some time. He was allowing himself to think it more clearly now. Write to him, he said. She picked up her pen. The letter to Vincent Howell went out that same afternoon by the fastest available method. Elara wrote it herself, 3 careful pages, telling her cousin enough to make clear the seriousness of the matter, without including anything specific that could cause damage if the letter was intercepted. She told him she needed his advice urgently on a matter of justice that was beyond her ability to navigate alone. She told him she would travel to Northbourne if he was willing to receive her. She told him she was asking because she trusted him entirely, and because she believed he was precisely the right person for what she needed. She read it back to Edmund before sealing it. He read it and said it was excellent, and meant it. Frederick, after his conversation with Edmund, had moved quickly. Within 2 days he had confirmed what Edmund suspected. George, his nephew, had indeed passed the street name to someone, believing he was giving it as information about the estate's financial management rather than anything significant. George had not known what he was giving away. The person he had given it to had connections that eventually reached Draven's network. The chain had 3 steps, and none of the middle steps knew what they were carrying. Frederick told Edmund. Edmund told Alara. They agreed that George had not acted with any bad intent, and that the situation had been created by accident rather than betrayal, which mattered for how it was handled going forward. Does he know what he did? Alara asked. Not yet, Frederick said. He should be told, she said, not to punish him, so that he understands what to avoid in the future. Frederick looked at Edmund. Edmund nodded once. Frederick said he would handle it. The reply from Vincent Howell arrived on the 5th day. He was brief, as he had always been. Come as soon as you are able. Bring what you have. I will make time. Edmund read it over her shoulder. Then he looked at her. You were right about him, he said. I am usually right about people, she said, not with arrogance, simply as a statement of record. He almost smiled. Yes, he said. You are. They began to prepare. The preparation was its own kind of work, careful and detailed, and conducted in the specific privacy of the library and the morning room where only they and Frederick were present. Edmund assembled summaries of the documents, careful, precise summaries that told the story of the evidence without requiring Vincent Howell to travel to the storage building on his first meeting. He wrote a timeline of events from the first dinner at Draven's estate to the present, 4 years of work distilled into clean, organized pages. Alara reviewed everything he wrote. She caught 2 places where the language was too legal, and suggested plainer words. She caught one place where a date was wrong by 1 year, which Edmund had not noticed because he had been so close to the material for so long that certain numbers had blurred. She asked sharp questions about the logic of the timeline that made Edmund sharpen his answers, and the sharper answers improved the presentation materially. You're good at this, he said one evening, looking at her across the table where the documents were spread between them. She looked up. Good at what? Reading things, he said, finding the gaps. I spent a year reading my father's financial papers looking for gaps, she said. It's a transferable skill. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, I think about how different this would have looked 6 months ago, when I didn't know you. She looked at him. Is that something you think about often? He considered. More than I expected to, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the papers. Let's finish the timeline, she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked back down at the papers too. They finished the timeline. The plan for Agnes was more delicate. They could not go to her together, not yet, because Edmund arriving with his wife at the door of a frightened woman living under a false name in a northern town would be overwhelming at minimum and counterproductive at worst. The first contact needed to come alone, and it needed to come from someone Agnes had not already been frightened by. This was where Alara's argument from the previous week came back into the conversation. She raised it again carefully, not pushing, just noting that the situation was what it was, and that someone needed to go first. Edmund sat with it. He sat with it for 2 days. He thought about it thoroughly and from every angle, the way he thought about everything. He considered the risk to Alara. He considered the risk of not getting Agnes on board before the presentation to Howell, because without Agnes the case was strong but not complete. He considered the fact that Draven's people were watching the estate, which meant Alara leaving on a solo journey to Northbourne would look, to anyone watching, like a wife visiting a family connection, which was not suspicious. He came to her in the morning room on the 3rd day and said, I want to go over the safety arrangements before we agree to anything. She looked up. All right, she said. He sat down. He laid out the arrangements he was proposing. Frederick would travel in a separate carriage, 1 day ahead, using a different route. A second man, one of the estate groundsmen who had served in a military capacity before his current employment and who was thoroughly trustworthy, would be in Alara's carriage as a driver, without appearing to be anything other than a driver. Contact with Howell first, then Agnes, then back to the manor, no more than 5 days. Alara listened to all of this. And you? She asked. I will follow 2 days after you leave, he said, through a different route. We will meet at Howell's house. She nodded. That's sensible. Are you willing? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. I told you I would help. I meant it. He nodded. He looked at his hands on the arms of the chair. I don't like it, he said. She understood what he meant. Not the plan. The fact of her going into something he could not control. I know, she said, but I'm going anyway. He looked at her, and the things she had seen occasionally at the corners of his expression, The near warmth, the almost smile, was there now more fully than it had ever been. Not quite a smile, something closer to a person looking at something they had not expected, and being very glad they were looking at it. "Yes," he said, "I know you are." 3 days later, Ilara Voss, Duchess of Ashvale, left the manor in a plain carriage with a quiet driver who had served in the infantry, and a bag packed for 5 days, and the careful summary of 4 years of evidence in a sealed case in the luggage. Edmund stood at the front door and watched the carriage go down the drive through the oak trees and turn onto the road. Oliver the cat sat beside him at the door, looking after the carriage in the same direction. Edmund looked down at the cat. The cat looked up at him. He went back inside. He had 2 days of waiting to do, and he was not a man who waited easily, but he would do it because that was what the plan required, and the plan was good. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. He picked up his pen. He could not write anything useful. He put the pen down. He looked at the window. He thought about Ilara in the carriage on the winter road, steady-faced and thinking, already planning whatever she would say to Vincent Howell and whatever she would say to Agnes when she found her. He thought about the morning room with the moved chair and the books on the windowsill. He thought about the 5 days of the storm, the library, the sitting room, the dinner table. He thought about her hand over his. He sat at his desk in his quiet study and thought about all of these things, and for the first time in 4 years the quiet of the house did not feel like the absence of something. It felt like a pause between one thing and the next, like a breath held before a change. He picked up his pen. He began to write. Agnes opened the door 2 inches. Ilara stood on the step of the small house on the edge of Northbourne's eastern street and looked through the 2-inch gap at a pair of eyes that had been frightened for a very long time. Not the bright, immediate fright of something that has just happened, but the settled, permanent kind. The kind that becomes part of a person's expression, part of the way they hold their shoulders, part of the way they look at the world and see primarily what could go wrong. She had found the house through Vincent Howell. Howell had known, through the specific network of a magistrate who had worked in this district for 20 years, that a woman named Agnes Carr, formerly of a household in the South, had been living in Northbourne for 3 years under the name Agnes Ford. He had known this because his job required him to know things, and he kept his knowledge carefully. He had not told anyone. He told Ilara because Ilara had sat across from him for 3 hours in his study the previous morning and explained the situation with the same clarity and precision she had brought to everything since this began. And Vincent Howell had recognized almost immediately that his young cousin's wife was the kind of person who told the truth, and the truth she was telling required him to help. He had given Ilara the address. He had offered to come with her. She had asked him to let her go alone. Now she stood in front of the 2-inch gap and the frightened eyes and said, "My name is Ilara Hargrove. I am not here to threaten you or to force anything. I am here because I think you are a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time, alone, and I think it is time for that to stop, if you want it to stop." The eyes through the gap did not change, did not soften, did not harden, just watched. "I know what happened at the Draven estate," Ilara said. "I know that you were there. I know that you saw something. I know that you were told, in a way that left you no choice at the time, to be silent." She paused. "I am not going to tell you what to do now. That is your decision. It has always been your decision, even when it did not feel like one." A long silence. The wind moved down the street. Somewhere further along, a child was calling to someone. The door opened a little wider, not all the way, just enough. Agnes was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older. She had a face that would have been pleasant if it had been allowed to relax, and she wore the permanent, careful expression of someone who had learned to stay very quiet and hoped that being quiet would keep them safe. She was looking at Ilara with an attention that was different from a normal look. It was the look of a person who had survived by being very good at assessing whether something in front of them was a threat. She did not say anything yet. She was still assessing. Ilara stood still and let her look. She did not push. She did not explain further. She had said what she needed to say, and the next move was Agnes's. Finally Agnes said, "How did you find me?" "Through the magistrate Vincent Howell," Ilara said. "He is a good man. He does not work for anyone you need to be afraid of." Agnes was quiet for another moment. "And your husband," she said. "He knows you are here." "Yes," Ilara said. "He will arrive in 2 days. But I wanted to come first because I thought you might find it easier to speak with me than with him. I may be wrong about that." Something in Agnes's face shifted. Not much, but something. "Come in," she said. She made tea. This seemed important to her, the physical work of the kettle and the cups and the careful arrangement of things on the small kitchen table, and Ilara understood that this was not hospitality exactly, but was something Agnes needed to do with her hands while she decided what she was going to say. Alara sat at the table and waited, and did not say anything. When Agnes sat down across from her with the 2 cups between them, she looked at Alara for a long moment and then said, "He has been looking for me for a long time." "Edmund?" Alara said. "Draven," Agnes said. Alara was quiet. "Not to hurt me," Agnes said, in the careful way of someone making very precise distinctions, because precise distinctions are what keep you safe. "He doesn't know what I saw. He only knows that I was there, in the house, that night, and he knows that anyone who was there, in the house, that night, is a possible problem." She paused. "He had people ask about me in the town I was living in before this one. That is why I moved here." "You have been running," Alara said. "Not a judgment, a fact." "Yes," Agnes said. She looked at her tea. "For 3 years." Alara thought about 3 years of living under someone else's name, in a town where you did not know anyone, checking over your shoulder, moving when the asking got too close. She thought about what that did to a person. She thought about the eyes through the 2-inch gap. "You don't have to run anymore," she said. "If you are willing to speak with us, with Howell, with the proper authorities that Howell can make available, then the situation changes. You are not alone in this, and Draven cannot silence what is already in motion." Agnes looked up. "How much is in motion?" "Enough," Alara said. "Edmund has been building for 4 years. He has documents and written statements and a timeline that is documented carefully. He has the beginning of a case. What he doesn't have is a witness to what was done on the night Cecilia died." She paused. "What he needs is what you know." Agnes was very still. "You don't have to decide now," Alara said. "Edmund will be here in 2 days. You can speak with him, or with Howell, or with both of them together, or with none of them, if that is what you choose. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, you are no longer alone in this. That is true regardless of your decision." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You remind me of her." Alara did not need to ask who she meant. "She was like this," Agnes said. "Direct, not frightening, just direct." She looked away. She was kind to the staff at Draven's house. Most guests weren't, not particularly. But she was. She knew our names. She asked questions that were actual questions, not the kind people ask when they are being polite but don't care about the answer. Alara said nothing. She let Agnes have the moment with the memory. "I liked her," Agnes said, "which is why I couldn't do anything, and why I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." She looked at her hands. "I know what I saw. I have known it for 4 years and I have not told anyone, because I have been frightened and because I thought I would not be believed." She paused. "And because I thought no one was looking." "Someone has been looking," Alara said. "He has been looking for 4 years." Agnes looked at her again. Her face was doing something that it had perhaps not done for a long time. It was considering the possibility of something other than fear. "What would happen," Agnes said carefully, "if I told what I know to the magistrate?" Alara told her. Honestly, precisely, without minimizing the difficulty or exaggerating the certainty. She told her what Howell had said about his ability to act, what protections were legally available, what it would mean in practical terms. She told her it would not be easy. She told her it would matter. Agnes listened to all of it. She drank her tea. She looked out the small kitchen window at the northern sky, which was white with winter. Then she said, "All right." Alara looked at her. "Not today," Agnes said. "I need to think about it properly. I need to sleep on it." She paused. "But come back tomorrow, with the magistrate if you can bring him, and I will tell you what I know." Alara said, "Thank you." Agnes shook her head. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I haven't done anything yet." "You opened the door," Alara said. Agnes looked at her. The frightened quality in her eyes had not disappeared, but underneath it, something else was present now. Something that had been packed away under years of caution, and was carefully, slowly beginning to surface. Alara walked back through the town to the house where Howell had arranged her accommodation. The sky was low, and the cold was genuine, and she walked with her coat pulled close and her thoughts moving at the same pace as her feet, steady and purposeful. She thought about Agnes. She thought about Cecilia, whom she had never known but felt she was beginning to know through the way everyone who had known her spoke about her, the warmth and the directness and the way she had known the names of the staff. She thought about what had been done to her and what had been allowed to happen after, the years of it, the weight of it. She thought about Edmund, 2 days away, working through his waiting with his pen and his carefully organized thoughts. She thought about writing to him. She thought about what she would say. She went back to her accommodation. She sat down at the desk in the small room that Howell had arranged and she wrote to Edmund. She told him that Agnes would speak. She told him to come. She sealed the letter. She gave it to the man Howell had assigned to carry correspondence, who would have it to the next stage of the relay within an hour. Edmund would have it tomorrow morning. She sat back in the chair. The room was warm. Outside the window, the northern town was going about its ordinary business, ordinary people going through ordinary afternoons, none of them knowing that in a small house on the eastern street, a woman named Agnes Ford had opened a door 2 inches wider than she had opened it in 3 years. It was not everything. It was the beginning of everything. Ilara thought about Draven's letter, 6 lines of elegant, pointed warning. She thought about the careful way it had called her a vulnerability. She thought about what it would feel like, in the weeks to come, for Gregory Draven to understand how wrong he had been about that. She found, sitting alone in the winter room in Northbourne, that she was looking forward to it. Edmund arrived at Vincent Howell's house on Thursday afternoon, 1 day ahead of schedule. He had not been able to wait the full 2 days. He told himself it was because the plan allowed for early arrival, and the route had been clear. He knew it was because the letter had arrived Wednesday morning, and he had not been able to remain still after reading it. He arrived to find Ilara already there, sitting with Howell in the study over papers and tea. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, carefully and completely. "She will speak tomorrow," Ilara said. He nodded. He sat down. Howell handed him a cup of tea and he held it and looked at the papers on the desk between them and felt the shape of 4 years of solitary work finally, becoming something shared and moving and real. He looked at Ilara. She was already reading something that Howell had just handed her, focused and present and entirely at ease, as though sitting in a magistrate's study in a northern town in winter. Planning the exposure of a powerful man was simply the next thing on her list. He thought, she is remarkable. He thought, I have been thinking that for months. He thought, I should tell her. He would. Not tonight, because tonight was for the work, but soon. Agnes spoke the next morning. She came to Howell's house at 9 o'clock. She had dressed carefully, which Ilara noticed because it seemed important. The small deliberate act of a person who was about to do something significant and was showing up to it with intention. Edmund was there. He stood when Agnes came in and he introduced himself with the specific economy of someone who understands that the person in front of him has been afraid of powerful men and is not going to add to that experience by performing his own power. He said his name. He said he was grateful she had come. He said he would listen. Agnes sat down. She looked at Edmund for a moment and then she looked at Ilara, and Ilara gave her the kind of look that meant, "You are not alone." Then Agnes spoke. She spoke for nearly 2 hours. She spoke about the night of the dinner at Draven's estate, about what she had seen in the corridor of the East Wing, about the man she had seen speaking with Cecilia, and the expression on Cecilia's face when she came back to the other guests. She spoke about the weeks after the dinner, about the changes in the household staff, and what she had been told about those changes. She spoke about the night Cecilia came back to Draven's house, the second visit, the one that no one had known about because Cecilia had been brought there not as a guest but as someone whose problem was being managed. She spoke about the doctor and what she had seen from the corridor outside the room. She spoke about the morning she had been told, by a man she did not know and would never see again, what would happen to her if she mentioned any of this to anyone. Howell sat across from her and listened, and took notes in his small, neat handwriting. Edmund sat very still. Ilara sat beside Agnes and did not move. When Agnes finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Howell said, "You have done a very courageous thing." Agnes looked at him. "I should have done it 4 years ago," she said. "You were frightened 4 years ago," Howell said. "Being frightened is not a moral failure." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I suppose not." Howell asked 3 follow-up questions, precise and clear. Agnes answered all 3. Then he closed his notebook and said he would need time to review what she had told him alongside the documentation Edmund had brought. He estimated 48 hours. Agnes stood to leave. At the door she stopped and looked back at Edmund. "She was kind," she said. "Cecilia, I want you to know that. I never forgot how kind she was." Edmund looked at her. His face was very still. "I know," he said quietly. "Thank you." Agnes left. The room was quiet. Ilara looked at Edmund. He was looking at the table. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be the right thing, and silence was more honest. After a moment he looked up. His face had done what it did, folded the feeling back under the composure, but she had seen it, the brief moment before the fold, and it was enough to understand what this had cost him, and what it had also, somehow, given him. 48 hours, he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Then we wait. The 48 hours were quiet. They walked in the town, which was small and ordered, and entirely uninterested in them. They ate at the inn near Howell's house. They talked, the way they had been talking for weeks now, easily and without performance. She told him more about her childhood in the house that was always slightly in need of repair. He told her more about his grandmother and the library and what the estate had been like when it was fully alive. He told her something on the second evening that he said in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that she recognized as the tone he used for things that cost him something to say. "I have not been grateful for my life for a long time," he said. "I have managed it. I have attended to it. I have been responsible for it." He paused. "I have not been grateful for it." She looked at him. "I am grateful for it now," he said. She understood what he was telling her. She did not make him say it more plainly than that. She understood it. "Good," she said. He looked at her. The thing that lived at the corners of his expression, the warm, particular thing, was not at the corners this time. It was fully present, and he did not appear to be trying to put it back under the composure. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him take it. On the morning of the 48th hour, Howell called them both to his study. He had the notes from Agnes's account alongside Edmund's documentation. He had spent 2 days being very thorough, which was what Howell did with everything. He told them what he believed he could do. He had colleagues in London, 2 of them, who were both in positions of sufficient independence to act on evidence of this nature, and who were of sufficient standing that their action could not be quietly absorbed by Draven's network before it reached consequence. He had spoken to both of them by correspondence, carefully and without naming names, and he had confirmed that both were willing to hear a properly documented case. He told them the timeline. He told them what was needed in terms of formal presentation. He told them that Agnes would need to give her account once more, in a formal setting, which he would arrange to make as safe and manageable as possible. Then he looked at Edmund and said, "This will work. The evidence is sufficient. The witness is credible. And the 2 men I am referring this to are genuinely interested in doing what is right." He paused. "It will not be quiet. Once it moves, it will become known." Edmund said, "Good." Howell looked at him. "Draven will respond. He will attempt to discredit the process." "I know," Edmund said. "Are you prepared for that?" Edmund looked at Alara. She looked back at him. There passed between them, in the way that 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other for several months pass things without speaking, a clear and mutual understanding. "Yes," Edmund said, "we are." Howell nodded. "Then we begin." The formal presentation to Howell's colleagues in London was scheduled for 3 weeks' time. There were preparations to make and details to coordinate, and a great deal of careful, patient work still ahead. But the shape of what was coming was now clear, and the shape was one that could not be undone, because it was no longer only Edmund carrying it. They drove back to Ashvale Manor on a Friday, through countryside that was still cold but showing the first green suggestions of the spring that was several weeks away. Alara watched the fields go past the carriage window. Edmund read the final copy of Howell's case summary. Oliver the cat would be on the morning room windowsill. Mrs. Burrow would have dinner ready. The manor came into view at the end of the drive, gray and large and entirely itself, exactly as it always was. Alara looked at it as the carriage moved toward it, and felt something she had not expected to feel when she had stood in front of it that first morning with the cold pressing through her shoes. She felt she was coming home. Edmund looked at her, looking at the house. She turned and found him watching. "The east wing," she said. "When we get back, the shutters are open now." "Yes," he said. "I'd like to see it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'll show you." The carriage went through the gate and down the long drive, and the oak trees stood on either side, tall and bare and beginning, at the very tips of their uppermost branches, to show the very first and smallest signs of bud. Spring was still weeks away, but it was coming. You could see it if you were looking closely enough. Edmund was looking. Alara was looking. And in the manor behind the gates, Oliver the cat sat in the morning room window watching the carriage approach, entirely unsurprised, in the way of creatures who knew all along how things were going to go. The formal hearing in London took place on a Tuesday in late March. The room was not dramatic. It was a legal room in a legal building, functional and plain, with a long table and 6 chairs, and the specific quality of light that comes through tall windows in a city where the sky is often gray. Edmund had been in rooms like it before, in the course of various legal and financial matters over the years, and he had always found them neutral, merely appropriate to the business being conducted. This time the room felt different. This time what was being conducted was something he had carried for 4 years in the particular way you carry something you cannot put down, and putting it down at last required a room to put it in. Howell's two colleagues were named Mr. Pratt and Lord Compton. Pratt was a senior legal official whose jurisdiction included cases of this kind when brought with sufficient documentation and credible witness testimony. Compton was a peer with particular responsibility for a parliamentary oversight committee that had authority over matters of serious misconduct among persons of prominence. They were both present, and both had read the documentation Edmund had provided, and both had heard a preliminary account from Howell before today. They heard the full account today. Edmund presented first. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, completely, precisely, without unnecessary ornamentation. He presented the timeline, he presented the documentation, he presented the written statements from the two other women who had not been willing to appear in person but had provided accounts in writing, accounts that had taken Edmund 18 months to obtain with the patience and care those women deserved. He answered questions from Pratt and Compton with the clear, direct manner he brought to all difficult conversations. Agnes presented second. Elara sat beside her. Agnes had said the previous day that she would feel better with someone beside her. Elara had said she would be there, and she was there, and she sat very still and very present for the entire 2 hours of Agnes's testimony, and when it was over she put her hand briefly on Agnes's arm, and Agnes looked at her, and something passed between them that did not need words. Pratt asked his questions. Compton asked his questions. Both of them asked with the careful rigor of people who understood what they were being asked to look at and were taking it seriously. The specific serious quality of a person who has decided that this is real and that it matters, and that they intend to act on it. The hearing closed at 3 in the afternoon. Pratt said he would need to consult with his office. Compton said similarly. They gave no verdict and made no promises, and said they would correspond within 10 days. Edmund had expected this. The law did not move at the speed of a personal decision. It moved at its own pace, and the pace was slower and more procedural, and patience was required. He had been patient for 4 years. 10 days was not a difficulty. They left the building. It was raining lightly, the mild gray March rain that is not cold exactly but not warm either. Howell had his umbrella. Frederick had arranged a carriage. Agnes's situation was now in the care of a specific arrangement Howell had made, a secured temporary accommodation where she would be comfortable, and where Draven's people would not be able to reach her while things moved forward. Edmund and Elara stood on the step of the building for a moment before the carriage came. The rain came down around them without effort. "Well," Elara said. "Well," Edmund agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were both doing something that was not quite smiling, a compression of something larger that required a quieter expression on a public step in the rain. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We did." The carriage arrived. They got in. The city moved past the windows in the rain, ordinary and occupied, and entirely unaware of what had just happened in the building behind them. Draven's response, when it came, was precisely what Edmund had anticipated. It came within a week of the hearing, before Pratt and Compton's 10 days had expired, which told Edmund that Draven had people inside the building or near enough to it to know that something had happened. The response was not a letter this time. It was a social maneuver, the kind Draven was very good at. A sudden campaign of reputation by association, conducted through his extensive network. Stories circulated through drawing rooms and club rooms about Edmund Hargrove's character and the reliability of his motives, and the possibility that the Duke of Ashvale had personal reasons for pursuing this particular line of complaint. Elara read about it in a letter from Clara, who moved in the social world and who heard things, and who reported what she heard with the clear-eyed accuracy of a young woman who was very good at knowing what was actually going on. She showed the letter to Edmund. He read it without expression. "He is throwing things at the wall," he said. "Yes," she said, "which means he is frightened. Which means Pratt or Compton, or both, has said something he has been told about," Edmund said. "Or he has heard about the hearing through his other channels," she said, "and has concluded that it went badly for him." "Also possible," Edmund said. He set the letter down. "None of this changes anything." "No," she agreed. He looked at her. "It may become unpleasant," he said, "publicly, for a time." "I have been through unpleasant publicly," she said. "I managed it before I had your name. I expect I'll manage it with it." He looked at her for a moment. "You know," he said, "that you are considerably more than the person I was expecting when I made the offer in the garden." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Who were you expecting?" He thought about this with the genuine consideration he gave to all questions. "Someone grateful," he said. "Someone who would take the arrangement on its terms and live quietly within it and cause no complications." "And instead you got me," she said. "And instead I got you," he agreed. Which has been, he paused, quite different. Better or worse, she asked. She asked it lightly, but she was watching him. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months, completely, and without deflection. The way Edmund Hargrove looked at the things he had decided were important. Better, he said. Considerably. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I love you. It was not the way she had imagined saying it, standing in the morning room on a rainy March afternoon with the letter from Clara on the desk between them. But she had learned in the past several months that the right moment for saying important things is not always the one you have planned, and that waiting for the right moment sometimes means you end up not saying things that deserve to be said. Edmund was very still. I know that we did not plan for that, she said. I know this was supposed to be a transaction, and I know that you are a very careful person who does not do things without thinking about them first, so I am not expecting anything in particular back from you right now, but I have said it because it is true, and because I think true things are worth saying. Edmund looked at her. He looked at her with the expression that was not at the corners anymore, and had not been for some weeks now, fully present and undisguised, and doing something she had not seen from him before. He said, I know. She blinked. I know, he said again, more slowly. I have known for some time. I have been working up to saying it because it is, as you noted, not what I planned, and I have learned over the past months that my plans regarding you have consistently been insufficient. He paused. I love you, he said. I am reasonably certain I have loved you since you sat in my drawing room and read all 3 pages of the contract. She stared at him. He looked entirely serious, which was, she realized, the only way Edmund Hargrove said anything. That was the second time we met, she said. I am aware, he said. I was not prepared for how quickly the thing moved. I found it unsettling for some time. She looked at him. Then, very suddenly, she laughed. It was a real laugh, from the actual bottom of her, the kind that comes when something is both funny and also exactly right. He looked at her laughing. The thing on his face opened further. A real smile. She had seen it before, once, at dinner during the storm, but briefly. This one stayed. It was a good smile. It was a smile that looked like it had been waiting a long time to be given permission. Come here, she said. He came. He sat beside her on the chair, and she took his hand, and he held it, and they sat together in the morning room that she had made hers by simply living in it, with the rain outside, and the fire inside, and Oliver the cat on the windowsill watching them, with the satisfaction of an animal whose opinion has been thoroughly vindicated. The response from Pratt arrived 6 days later. Compton's letter came the same afternoon, separately, and they said the same thing in different words. The evidence was sufficient. The case would proceed through formal channels. A formal inquiry into the conduct of Lord Gregory Draven was being opened, and the inquiry had the standing and the authority to proceed regardless of Draven's social position or his network. Edmund read both letters at his desk. He read them twice. Then he put them face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. He went to the morning room. Elara looked up. He told her. She listened to both letters, which he quoted from memory, because Edmund remembered things that mattered precisely. She said nothing for a moment when he finished. Then she said, Cecilia's name. When the inquiry proceeds, will it be part of the record? Yes, he said. What was done to her, what happened after, it will be part of the formal record. Good, she said. She should be part of the record. He looked at her. He had been thinking this exact thing since he read the letters. He had not said it yet. She had said it before him. Yes, he said. She should. The inquiry took months. Draven fought it with everything he had, which was a great deal. He denied. He challenged. He attempted to discredit the evidence and the witnesses and the credibility of the officials conducting the inquiry. He brought his network to bear in the ways that powerful men bring their networks to bear, calling in debts and pressuring connections, and making it known that supporting the inquiry carried social costs. None of it was enough. The evidence was too solid. Agnes's testimony was too clear and too precise. The written statements from the other women, 2 of whom agreed to be identified by name as the inquiry gained strength, were too credible. Pratt was too thorough. Compton was too principled. And Edmund Hargrove, Duke of Ashvale, was too patient and too careful, and had spent 4 years building something that could not be torn down in the months Draven had available to tear at it. The finding of the inquiry, when it came, found Draven responsible for a series of serious offenses over many years. It found that Cecilia's death had not been accidental. It found that the suppression of previous complaints had been deliberate and funded. It found that a campaign of fear against witnesses had been conducted over 4 years. Draven lost his standing. He lost his position. The legal proceedings that followed the inquiry's finding took time, and the time was difficult, and Draven did not go quietly, but he went. Agnes was given her own name back, her real name, Agnes Carr, and the formal record included a statement about the courage she had shown. She wept when Howell told her about the statement. She said she had not done anything courageous. Howell said, "You opened the door. That is always the hardest part." Clara had her season. It was a good season. She met a young man whose name was Daniel and who laughed easily, and was genuinely kind, and who seemed to understand that he had met someone remarkable in Clara Voss, and he seemed entirely willing to organize his life around that understanding, which Alara thought was exactly the right response. Their mother lived to see it. Not the end of the inquiry, she was too ill by then to follow the details, but she lived to see Clara in her dresses. He lived to meet Edmund, who came to see her and sat with her for an hour, and spoke to her with the same precise courtesy he brought to everything. And afterward their mother told Alara that he was a good man and she was glad. She passed in November, peacefully, in the bedroom of the house that had been sold but which they were allowed to remain in until the spring, because the new owner was a decent person and had been told the circumstances. Alara was with her. Edmund came as soon as he could. He sat with Alara afterward in the garden of the house, even though it was November and cold, because she needed to be outside and he stayed wherever she needed to be. He did not say anything that was not true. He did not say it would be all right. He said he was there. He held her hand. She was grateful for that more than she could say. The east wing of Ashvale Manor was opened fully in the spring. Edmund had done it himself, one morning before Alara woke. When she came downstairs, the corridor door was open and the morning light was coming all the way through to the main hall. She walked to the corridor and looked in. All the doors were open, the rooms were aired, the furniture still had its dust covers, which would take time to sort through. But the light was in every room and the air was moving. At the end of the corridor, the last room was open. She walked to it and stood in the doorway. The portrait was uncovered. It stood on the far wall in the morning light, a painting of a young woman in a pale dress with dark hair and an expression that was warm and direct and very much alive. Cecilia. She was beautiful, and she looked like someone Alara thought she would have liked very much. The clock above the fireplace had been wound. It was ticking. Edmund came and stood beside her. They looked at the portrait together. "She would have liked you," he said. "Lord Pelham said something similar about your grandmother," Alara said. "She was a good judge of people," Edmund said, "and so was my grandmother." Alara looked at the portrait for a moment more. "We should take down the dust covers," she said, "this week." "Yes," Edmund said. They stood together in the room where the light was coming in for the first time in 4 years, and the clock above the fireplace counted out its ordinary seconds, and the spring pressed in from outside the windows, with the warmth and the green and the particular insistence of seasons that will not be prevented. After a while they went down to breakfast. Mrs. Burrow had made something with cinnamon. She had, as it turned out, been making the cinnamon thing every time Alara had asked for it in her first week, and for weeks and months after that, and it was excellent every time, and had been excellent enough that it had become simply the thing Mrs. Burrow made when the morning was particularly good. Edmund sat down across from Alara at the breakfast table. Oliver the cat appeared under his chair, and was firmly but affectionately relocated to the corridor by Edmund, who then came back and sat down and looked at Alara across the table in the morning light of the open house. She looked back at him. This was what it looked like. Not the dramatic moment in the garden, not the storm-lit library, not the hearing room in London. This was what it looked like in its ordinary form. Breakfast, and morning light, and a man who had been frozen for 4 years sitting across from a woman who had walked through a door with no idea what was on the other side of it, and both of them having arrived, through all the difficulty and work and patience and honesty, at the same place. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He thought about it, that this house is alive again, he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." He poured her tea. She thanked him. Outside, the spring went about its business without any concern for whether anyone was watching, because spring does not need an audience. It simply comes, as it always comes, as it always will, because that is what spring does. It follows the cold, reliably, every time, and it brings with it everything that the cold kept waiting. It had been a long winter. It was a very good spring.